Hello and thank you for joining for today's dark and scary cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Invitation. This is a cryptid horror story about the Skinwalker, a malicious, shape-shifting human from Navajo cultural tradition, naaldlooshii, who gains evil powers by wearing animal skins. In this story, an anthropology student who grew up in a Navajo community but drifted away returns to his ancestral lands for a family gathering. He is joined by three friends from the city. During a night of drinking and arrogance, one of the friends begins mocking the superstitions of the local elders, specifically questioning the reality of the naaldlooshii. To prove there is nothing to fear, the friend loudly proclaims the name and nature of the Skinwalker to the night air, essentially inviting the entity's attention by treating the taboo as a joke. The second story today is called The Vespers of Bone. This is a cryptid horror story about the Jikininki, a cannibalistic yokai or hungry ghost from Japanese Buddhist folklore cursed to feed exclusively on human corpses. In this story, a remote mountain village in Japan, centered around a crumbling Buddhist temple that serves as the local mortuary. A young novice monk begins noticing glitches in the environment. During the day, the temple ruins are just overgrown piles of stone. But at twilight, a sprawling, invisible wing of the temple manifests, a place where the air smells of old copper and wet earth. Reports surface of grave-robbing animals, but the villagers find it odd that the bodies are not stolen, only consumed. In the description below, the stories have been time-stamped. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Invitation. The forest had no right to be this quiet. John So had grown up in the shadow of these mesas, had played among the juniper and piñon until his knees were stained green with sap, and his mother's voice carried across the arroyos at dusk, calling him home for supper. He knew the sounds of this land the way he knew his own heartbeat, the rustle of sagebrush in a dry wind, the distant bark of a coyote greeting the moon, the soft percussion of a jackrabbit's paws against red sandstone. But tonight, as he ran through the darkness with blood streaming from a gash across his forehead and his lungs burning like bellows full of ash, there was nothing. No wind, no insects, no night birds. Just the terrible, suffocating silence of a world that had stopped breathing. And behind him, impossibly close, the sound of his own voice pleading for help in a tone of absolute desperation that he had never uttered aloud but recognized with a soul-deep certainty that made his stomach twist into knots of ice-cold terror. "John," it called, perfect in every intonation, every nasal hitch, every breathless panic. "John, please, I can't run anymore, it's got my leg, oh God, John, help me, it's tearing." He clamped his hands over his ears, his palms slick with sweat and pine resin, and ran harder. Branches whipped his face, leaving thin, stinging lines across his cheeks. His right ankle had turned somewhere back near the dry creek bed, and every footfall sent a jolt of white-hot agony shooting up his shin, but he didn't slow. He couldn't slow. Because somewhere behind him, in the absolute blackness between the ponderosa pines, something was wearing his voice like a comfortable shirt. And if he stopped, if he turned, if he answered that desperate cry with his own terrified response, he knew with the instinctive certainty of prey, that the last sound he would ever hear would be his own laughter coming from a throat that was not his own. 3 days earlier, the world had still made sense. The sun had risen over the Navajo nation the way it had for 10,000 years, painting the buttes in shades of amber and rose. And John had been a 26-year-old anthropology graduate student with a sensible Subaru, a mountain of student debt, and the vague, uncomfortable feeling that he had spent the last decade of his life trying to outrun a heritage he no longer understood. He had left the reservation at 18, armed with scholarships and the desperate ambition of a boy who had grown up watching his grandparents weave rugs in the dim light of a hogan without electricity, who had promised himself that he would never again shiver through a winter morning while hauling water from a communal pump. He had gone to the city, first Albuquerque, then Flagstaff, then the sprawling, sun-bleached concrete of Phoenix, and he had learned the language of academia, had learned to translate the sacred into the theoretical, to speak of cultural practices and anthropological frameworks, while his grandmother's voice echoed in the back of his mind, telling him in Navajo that some things were not meant to be studied, only respected. Now he was coming back, and he was bringing 3 pieces of luggage with him: a duffel bag full of clean jeans and sensible hiking boots, a heart full of unresolved guilt, and 3 friends from the city who understood the Southwest the way tourists understand ancient ruins, as a backdrop for selfies, as a place to get spiritually cleansed between brewery tour, as a culture that existed for their consumption and entertainment. Marcus Chen had been John's roommate at the University of Arizona for 3 years, a computer science major from Scottsdale who wore designer sunglasses indoors and spoke of the res, with the casual authority of someone who had read half a Wikipedia article and watched a documentary on Netflix. He was handsome in a polished, artificial way, with teeth that had been straightened by invisible braces and a laugh that was always slightly too loud, as if he were perpetually performing the role of fun guy at the party, for an audience that had never asked for the show. Beside him in the backseat of John's Subaru was Priya Desai, Marcus's girlfriend of 8 months, a marketing executive who spoke in hashtags and treated every social interaction as a branding opportunity. She had brought 3 suitcases for a 4-day trip and had already complained twice about the lack of cell service before they had crossed the Arizona-New Mexico border. And in the passenger seat, because John had drawn the short straw in the friendship hierarchy, was Derek Holloway, a philosophy graduate student who fancied himself an iconoclast, a man who had made contrarianism his entire personality and who viewed any traditional belief system, indigenous, religious, or cultural, as a delightful target for his performative skepticism. "So let me get this straight," Derek had said somewhere outside Gallup, his voice dripping with the condescension that John had learned to tolerate over 2 years of shared seminars. "Your grandmother actually believes that if someone says the wrong name at night, a magical monster is going to come eat them. Like, in the year 2026, with smartphones and space telescopes, we're still doing the boogeyman thing." John had kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. The desert scrolled past in an endless panorama of red rock and blue sky, and he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation of being caught between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither, condemned to translate one to the other until his tongue grew thick with the effort. "It's not about belief in the way you mean it," John had said carefully, choosing his words the way his grandmother chose the dyed wool for her rugs, each strand placed with intention. "The naaldlooshii isn't a monster under the bed. It's a person who made a choice, a person who broke every law of the community, every spiritual taboo, to gain power. The taboo exists because the reality of what they become is. It's worse than any story." "A person," Derek had repeated, smirking. "So it's not even supernatural, it's just a guy in a costume." John had felt Marcus lean forward from the backseat, interested now, his phone forgotten in his lap. "Wait, is this like that thing I saw on TikTok? The Skinwalker thing? Dude, those videos are wild. People saying they saw them on the highway at night, like running alongside their cars." "It's not entertainment," John had said, and his voice had come out sharper than he intended, edged with something that surprised even him, a protective ferocity, the kind of anger that comes from watching outsiders treat your grandmother's prayers like content for their feeds. "I'm serious, Derek. Don't joke about this. Don't say the name out loud like it's nothing. My family, they take this seriously. The elders take it seriously. There's a reason we don't talk about it after dark. There's a reason the old stories say that if you speak of them, they hear you, and if they hear you, they come." Derek had thrown his hands up in mock surrender, but his eyes had glittered with that particular delight that John had come to recognize, the delight of a man who had found a new toy to break. "Easy, John. I'm just saying, it sounds like classic boogeyman mythology to me. Every culture has it. It's a control mechanism. Don't go out at night or the monster will get you. Keeps the kids in line. Keeps the adults from asking too many questions. Derek, Priya had chimed in from the back, her voice carrying the bright, brittle tone of someone who had decided the conversation was an opportunity to demonstrate her worldliness. Maybe we should respect John's culture. Hashtag sacred traditions, you know. John had let it go. He had let it go because he had spent 10 years letting it go. Because the alternative was to become the angry Indian in every room. Because he wanted his friends to like him. And he wanted to believe that their ignorance was harmless. That a college-educated man in a Patagonia vest making jokes about skinwalkers at a gas station in New Mexico was somehow different from the missionaries and anthropologists who had spent centuries treating his people's most sacred beliefs as quaint folklore to be catalogued and dismissed. He had let it go, and that decision would cost 4 people their lives. They arrived at his grandmother's hogan just after sunset on the second day of driving. The Tso family had gathered for the annual summer reunion, a tradition that had persisted even as the younger generation scattered to cities and suburbs, even as the old ways faded like photographs left in the sun. There were cousins John hadn't seen since childhood, aunties who clucked over his thin frame and pressed plates of mutton stew into his hands, uncles who nodded gravely and asked about his studies in a way that made him feel like he was reporting on a foreign country rather than his own heritage. The hogan smelled of wood smoke and wool, and the sweet, earthy scent of fry bread cooking in cast iron. Outside, the sky was a deepening bruise of purple and orange, and the first stars were pricking through the veil of dusk like scattered needlework. John introduced his friends with the careful pride of a man showing off a part of himself he had kept hidden. Marcus charmed the aunties with his easy smile and his willingness to try the blue corn mush. Priya took photos of everything, the weaving looms, the sheep corrals, the sunset, and John tried not to resent her for it, tried to believe that documentation was its own form of respect. Derek was polite in a distant way, watching the proceedings with the analytical gaze of a man filing observations for later dissection, and John noticed how his grandmother's eyes lingered on Derek for just a moment too long, how she pressed an extra piece of fry bread into John's hand and whispered in Navajo, "That one carries shadow in his laugh." The first night was beautiful. There was a bonfire and someone brought out a drum, and the old songs rose into the darkness like smoke, carrying with them 1,000 years of memory. John felt something unknot in his chest, some tension he hadn't realized he was holding, and for a few hours he was just John, grandson of the Tso clan, welcome in a place that had never stopped being home even when he had stopped knowing how to come back. His friends drank the wine that Marcus had brought from the city, and Derek became louder, more expansive, his skepticism softening into something that almost looked like warmth as he listened to the stories around the fire. But the wine kept flowing, and the stars kept wheeling overhead, and somewhere around midnight, when the elders had gone to bed, and only the young people remained around the dying fire, the conversation shifted. Marcus started talking about the videos again, the TikToks and the Reddit threads, the blurry night vision footage and the hysterical first-person accounts. Priya pulled out her phone and started reading aloud from a top 10 Skinwalker sightings article she had found, her voice taking on the hushed, conspiratorial tone of a child telling ghost stories at a sleepover. And Derek, emboldened by alcohol and the intoxicating sense of intellectual superiority that he wore like a second skin, began to laugh. "Come on," he said, his voice carrying across the fire pit to where a few cousins were still cleaning up the remains of the feast. "You're all sitting here telling these stories like they're real, but nobody's ever actually seen one, right? I mean, really seen one. Not in a blurry video, not in a my cousin's friend's uncle saw it way. Actual proof." One of John's cousins, a quiet man named Benny who worked for the tribal police, looked up from the plates he was stacking. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle straightening that made John's stomach tighten with forewarning. "We don't talk about them," Benny said quietly. "Not after dark, not ever really." "Because you're scared?" Derek asked, and John heard the challenge in his voice, the deliberate provocation. "Or because you know it's not real? I mean, if these things were actually out there, actually dangerous, there'd be evidence. There'd be bodies. There'd be something more than scary stories to keep people from wandering off at night." "Derek," John said, but his voice came out weak, drowned by the crackle of the fire and Derek's rising volume. "I'm just saying it seems convenient, doesn't it? A monster that only appears to people who believe in it. A creature that can't be photographed or recorded properly. Sounds like the perfect way to control a population. Keep them afraid, keep them inside, keep them from asking questions about why their land keeps getting stolen or why their water keeps getting poisoned. It's a coping mechanism, a metaphor." Benny set down the plates. His hands were thick and scarred, the hands of a man who had worked with livestock and machinery his entire life, and they trembled slightly as he wiped them on his jeans. "You don't understand what you're talking about," he said, and his voice was not angry but sad, deeply sad, the kind of sadness that comes from watching someone play with fire in a room full of gasoline. "Then explain it to me," Derek said, spreading his arms wide, the picture of reasonable, open-minded inquiry. "Explain why I should believe that there's a magical shapeshifter living in the woods instead of, coyotes and bears and people's overactive imaginations." John stood up. He moved to Derek's side to put a hand on his shoulder, to pull him away from the fire and the conversation and the terrible momentum that was building like thunder before a storm. But he was too slow. He was always too slow. "You want to invite it?" Benny asked, and his voice had dropped to a whisper that cut through the night more effectively than any shout. "You want to call it by name and dare it to show itself? Fine, but you do it alone. You don't do it around my family. You don't do it on this land." "Benny," John said, "he's drunk, he doesn't know what he's—" "I know exactly what I'm doing," Derek interrupted, and he was on his feet now, swaying slightly, his face flushed with wine and the adrenaline of confrontation. "I'm proving a point. I'm showing that there's nothing out there but darkness and stars and animals doing what animals do." "Ye naaldlooshii," he shouted it, his voice cracking on the Navajo syllables, mangling the pronunciation but making the meaning unmistakable. "Skinwalker, I'm not afraid of you. Come out and show yourself if you're real. Come and get me. Ye naaldlooshii, ye naaldlooshii." The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of a quiet night, but the silence of something holding its breath. Even the fire seemed to dim, the flames guttering low and orange, and John felt the hair on his arms rise as if the air itself had become charged with static electricity. Every cousin who had been cleaning up had stopped. Every conversation had died. In the darkness beyond the firelight, the dogs that had been dozing near the sheep corrals began to whine, a high, keening sound that raised the hackles on John's neck. "Derek," John whispered, his hand still on his friend's shoulder, his fingers digging in with desperate urgency. "Stop, please, stop." But Derek was laughing now, a brittle, defiant sound that echoed across the empty scrubland. "See? Nothing, just like I said, just stories to scare." The coyote appeared at the edge of the firelight without a sound. It stood at the boundary between illumination and darkness, its fur the color of dust and ash, its eyes reflecting the flames in two perfect amber discs. It was a normal coyote, John told himself. Just a coyote. They were common enough in the high desert, scavengers and opportunists, more curious than dangerous. But something about the way it stood was wrong. It didn't pace. It didn't sniff the air. It simply watched, its head tilted at an angle that seemed almost human, and when Derek turned to face it, the animal's lips pulled back in an expression that was not a snarl but something far more unsettling. A smile, or the approximation of one, too many teeth visible in the firelight. "Okay," Marcus said from behind John, his voice suddenly very small. "Okay, that's creepy." The coyote held their gaze for a long moment that stretched into eternity. Then, with a fluidity that seemed impossible, it turned and loped away into the darkness, moving not with the erratic, nervous gait of a wild animal, but with a deliberate, almost leisurely pace, as if it had seen everything it needed to see and was now going to report back. "It's just a coyote," Derek said, but his voice had lost its bravado, had shrunk to something tight and uncertain. "It's just a coyote." No one answered him. Benny had already turned away, walking back toward his truck with his shoulders hunched and his head down, and John watched him go with a sinking feeling in his gut that had nothing to do with the wine. His grandmother appeared in the doorway of her hogan, a silhouetted figure against the warm yellow light, and she didn't call out to them. She simply stood there, watching, and John could feel her disappointment and her fear from 50 feet away, a physical weight that pressed against his chest. They slept that night in tents near the hogan, at John's insistence. He had convinced his friends that camping was part of the authentic experience. But the truth was that he couldn't bear the thought of them sleeping inside his grandmother's home after what Derek had done. He lay awake for hours in his sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds, waiting for the silence that would tell him something was wrong. But the night was normal. The insects sang. The wind whispered through the sage, and eventually, exhausted by the drive and the tension, he fell into a thin, restless sleep. The next morning they packed up early. John made excuses to his family, too much work back in the city, a seminar he had forgotten about, the usual lies that adults tell to escape uncomfortable situations. His grandmother pressed a small leather pouch into his hands, filled with corn pollen and something that smelled of cedar, and she wouldn't meet his eyes as she whispered, "Don't stop until you're off the mountain. Don't look back. Don't answer if it calls your name." He had nodded, shame burning his cheeks, and loaded his friends into the Subaru. They were planning to spend one more night at a remote family cabin that John's uncle owned, a hunting lodge in the ponderosa pine forest near the Chuska Mountains, before heading back to civilization. It was a beautiful drive, the road winding through landscapes of red rock and golden grass, and for a few hours John managed to convince himself that the previous night had been a strange, wine-soaked dream, that the coyote had been just a coyote, and Derek's shouting had been just drunken foolishness. They were 30 miles from the cabin when they saw the deer. It was in the middle of the dirt road, motionless, a dark shape against the pale dust. John slowed the Subaru to a crawl, his headlights washing over the animal in a harsh white glare, and at first he thought it was just a deer that had been hit by another vehicle and left for the scavengers. But as he brought the car to a stop, 10 feet from the carcass, he realized that what he was looking at was not a deer that had been struck by a car. It was inside out. The skin had been peeled back from the skull, from the torso, from the legs, not with the rough efficiency of a predator but with a deliberate, almost surgical precision. The muscles glistened in the headlights, wet and red and still somehow twitching, as if the nerves hadn't yet received the message that the animal was dead. But the worst part, the part that made Priya gag and turn away, that made Marcus press his hand against the passenger window as if to push himself farther from the sight, was the skin itself. It had not been discarded. It had been arranged. The pelt was draped over the animal's body like a cloak that had been put on wrong, or like someone had tried to wear it and had given up halfway through. The deer's head was still attached to the skin, but it hung upside down, the empty eye sockets staring at the ground, the tongue lolling from a jaw that had been unhinged. "What the fuck?" Derek whispered, and for the first time since John had known him, there was no irony in his voice, no performative detachment. Just pure, childlike terror. John didn't answer. He was staring at the carcass, his mind racing through every story his grandmother had ever told him, every warning whispered by elders around winter fires. The naaldlooshii didn't just kill, it wore. It took the skin of animals and wore them like clothing, like masks, and the transformation was never perfect because a human body wasn't meant to fit inside the skin of a deer, a coyote, a wolf. The deformity was the point. The wrongness was the signature. "We need to go," John said, and his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone older and more frightened. "We need to go right now." "Shouldn't we? I don't know, call someone," Marcus asked, his phone already in his hand, but there was no signal, had been no signal for the last 20 miles. "The Forest Service or—" "There's no one to call," John said, and he put the car in drive and steered carefully around the carcass, trying not to look at the way the skin swayed in the draft from the Subaru's passage, trying not to imagine the hands that had arranged it, the intelligence that had placed it in the middle of the road like a message written in a language he didn't want to understand. In the rearview mirror, as the car pulled away, John thought he saw the deer's skin move. Just a twitch, a shift in the headlight's reflection. But when he looked again, there was nothing but dust and the darkness gathering behind them like a tide. They drove the rest of the way to the cabin in silence. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the pine forest in shades of violet and burnt orange, and the cabin itself looked almost idyllic, a low wooden structure with a porch that overlooked a small meadow, smoke curling from a chimney that John's uncle must have prepared for their arrival. But the beauty of the place felt false now, like a stage set built over a mass grave, and when John stepped out of the car and felt the evening air against his face, he realized that the forest was silent again. No birds, no insects, just the wind moving through the pine needles with a sound like someone whispering his name. "It was probably poachers," Derek said as they unloaded their bags, his voice too loud in the quiet. "Or, I don't know, some sicko. People do messed up stuff in the woods. That doesn't mean, it doesn't prove anything." "Derek," John said, turning to face his friend with a sudden fierceness that surprised them both. "Shut up, just shut up. I don't care what you believe or don't believe. I don't care about your skepticism or your rational explanations. Something is wrong and you invited it, and now we are in the middle of nowhere with no phone service and a cabin that has 2 doors and 6 windows. So just shut up." Derek stared at him, his mouth hanging open, and for a moment John saw something flash in his friend's eyes, not anger but guilt, sharp and unmistakable. Then Derek looked away, muttering something about superstitious panic under his breath, but he didn't argue. They went inside. The cabin was warm and smelled of pine and old smoke, and for a few minutes John allowed himself to hope that they could just lock the doors, wait out the night, and drive back to the city in the morning. But hope, he was beginning to understand, was a luxury that had no place in this forest. Because as Priya pulled the curtains across the front window, she let out a small, strangled sound, and John looked up to see what she was seeing. In the meadow, standing at the tree line where the pine forest swallowed the last of the daylight, was a coyote. It was the same coyote from the night before, or one so similar that the distinction didn't matter. But this time, it was not alone. Behind it, half hidden in the shadows, something else stood. Something taller. Something with legs that were too long for any natural anatomy, joints that bent in directions that made John's eyes water to follow, and eyes that caught the last of the sunset and threw it back in 2 perfect, burning points of orange-red light. The creature didn't move. It just watched them with a patience that was older than the mountains, and John knew with a clarity that transcended fear that the invitation had been accepted. The door was open. The guest had arrived. And it was not going to leave until there was no one left to remember its name. The night fell upon the cabin like a shroud, heavy and suffocating and utterly without mercy. John had locked every door, checked every window, and pulled every curtain tight against the darkness. But the gestures felt futile, the desperate rituals of a man trying to close a door that had already been kicked off its hinges. The cabin had no electricity beyond a few battery-powered lanterns that cast a sickly yellow glow across the wooden walls, and the shadows they created seemed to move with a life of their own, pooling in corners and stretching across the floorboards like fingers testing for weaknesses. The four of them sat in the main room, a space that had felt cozy that afternoon and now felt like the interior of a coffin. Marcus had built a fire in the stone hearth, and it crackled and popped with comforting familiarity, but John couldn't stop staring at the chimney flue, wondering if something could come down through the narrow shaft, if the creature they had seen at the tree line could compress itself into impossible shapes, fold its two long limbs into spaces no human body should fit. He remembered his grandmother's voice, not from the previous morning but from a decade ago when he was 12 and had woken from a nightmare about a man with a wolf's head standing at the foot of his bed. "They don't need doors," she had whispered as she smoothed his hair back from his sweaty forehead. "They don't need windows. What they need is for you to invite them in, and once invited, they never need permission again." He had invited it. Not personally, not intentionally, but he had brought Derek into this place, had allowed his friend to desecrate the silence with his arrogance, had stood by while the most dangerous word in the Navajo language was shouted into the night like a challenge. Complicity, John was learning, was its own kind of guilt, and it tasted like copper and bile in the back of his throat. "We should set up watches," Marcus said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for nearly an hour. He looked older than he had that morning, the lines around his eyes deeper, his hands shaking slightly as he turned a poker over in his fingers. 2 hours on, 6 hours off. Someone stays awake, keeps the fire going. If anything happens, they wake the others. "Nothing's going to happen," Derek said, but the assertion lacked conviction, falling flat against the wooden walls like a leaf against stone. He sat in the corner armchair, his knees drawn up to his chest, and he hadn't touched the beer he had opened an hour ago. The condensation had formed a ring on the side table, and John watched a single droplet trace its way down the brown glass, thinking about blood, about the way it ran in the same lazy patterns. "You saw it," Priya whispered. She hadn't spoken since they had come inside, had just sat on the couch with her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the fire as if it were the only safe thing in the world. "You saw it. Don't tell me you didn't see it. The legs, the eyes. That wasn't a coyote, Derek. That wasn't an animal." "It was dark," Derek tried, but even he didn't seem to believe it anymore. "It was far away. Our eyes play tricks. The mind fills in gaps with—" "Shut up," John said quietly. "Please just shut up." The silence that followed was worse than the talking. In the absence of human voices, the cabin made its own sounds, the settling of old wood, the creak of beams contracting in the cooling air, the rustle of pine needles against the roof shingles. But beneath those sounds, John began to hear something else, or thought he did, a rhythm. A tapping, soft and deliberate like a fingernail against glass. He looked at the window across the room, the one that faced the meadow, but the curtains were drawn and he couldn't see anything beyond them. "Did you hear that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible over the fire. "Hear what?" Derek asked, but his head had snapped toward the window too, his body betraying his words. The tapping came again, not from the window facing the meadow, from above them, from the second story. John looked up at the ceiling, following the sound with his eyes as it moved across the wooden planks overhead. Tap, 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 tap. A pattern, deliberate and patient, like someone sending a message in a code they had all the time in the world to teach. The second story of the cabin consisted of a single loft bedroom with a low ceiling and a small round window that faced the forest. There was no balcony, no fire escape, no way for a person to reach that window from outside except by climbing 30 feet of sheer wall or by standing on something that shouldn't exist. "There's no one up there," Priya said, but she was already crying, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. We all checked, there's no one up there." Tab, 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 tab. The sound stopped directly above the center of the room, above the fire, above their heads. John counted his heartbeats in the silence that followed, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the tapping resumed, but it was different now. It was louder, more insistent, and beneath it, or perhaps woven through it, John heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. A scratching, like claws against wood, like the sound of an animal trying to dig its way through a barrier. "It's on the roof," Marcus breathed. "It's not on the roof," John said, and his voice sounded distant, detached, as if it were coming from the other end of a very long tunnel. "The roof is sloped. There's no flat surface. Whatever is making that sound, it's standing on something, or it's hanging." The scratching stopped. In its place came a new sound, and this one was worse than the tapping, worse than the claws, worse than anything John could have imagined in his darkest moments of childhood fear. It was breathing. Wet, labored breathing, the sound of lungs that were too large for the chest that contained them, of air moving through passages that were not shaped like human windpipes. It came from directly above them, from the loft, from the space beyond the low ceiling, and with it came a smell. The smell of old blood and fur that had been worn too long, of rot and musk and something else, something that John could only identify as wrongness, a fundamental violation of the natural order that his nose recognized even as his mind scrambled for explanations. "We need to get out of here," Derek said, and he was on his feet, his eyes wide and white in the firelight. "We need to get in the car and drive and not stop until we're back in the city. Right now. Right now." "The car keys are in my jacket," John said, pointing to the hook by the door where he had hung his coat. "And my jacket is by the door, and the door is 10 feet from the window, and I am not walking over there until I know what is outside that window." "Then look," Derek hissed. "Pull back the curtain and look." John didn't want to. Every instinct in his body, every evolved neural pathway designed to keep him alive, screamed at him to stay away from the window, to not draw attention to himself, to remain small and quiet and unnoticeable in the hope that the predator would pass him by. But someone had to look. Someone had to know. He stood up on legs that felt like they were made of water and wood pulp, and he took 3 slow steps toward the window, his hand reaching for the edge of the heavy wool curtain. His fingers touched the fabric. It was cold. Colder than it should have been, cold like it had been left outside in winter rather than hanging in a warm room. He took a breath, held it, and pulled the curtain back 6 inches. The wolf was pressed against the glass. Not outside the glass, against it. Its face filled the entire window, filling the frame from edge to edge, and the proportions were so wrong that John's brain couldn't process them at first, kept trying to fit what he was seeing into categories that didn't apply. The snout was too long, too narrow, as if the skull beneath had been stretched on a rack. The eyes were not the yellow-green of a normal wolf, but a burning, sickly orange red, like coals that had been stoked with fresh air, and they didn't reflect the lantern light the way an animal's eyes should have. They generated their own illumination, twin points of malevolent fire that seemed to bore into John's chest and read every secret he had ever kept. But the legs, oh God, the legs! They extended down past the bottom of the window frame, too long by half, jointed in the wrong places, bending backward at the knee and then forward again at what should have been the ankle. The creature wasn't standing on the ground outside the window. It was standing on something that raised it up to the 2nd story. Or perhaps it was simply tall enough that its head reached that high naturally, and the thought of either possibility made John's knees buckle. The wolf's lips peeled back from teeth that were too numerous, too sharp, too perfectly arranged in rows that receded into darkness. And then it smiled. There was no other word for the expression that distorted its muzzle, no way to describe the deliberate, knowing curl of those black gums except as a smile. A human expression of amusement and hunger and anticipation, and the recognition of that expression on an animal face was the most horrifying thing John had ever seen. He dropped the curtain and stumbled backward, colliding with the couch and falling onto Priya, who screamed. A high, piercing sound that seemed to satisfy something in the darkness, because the breathing from above resumed, faster now, excited, accompanied by a wet clicking sound that might have been a tongue against teeth. "What did you see?" Marcus demanded, grabbing John's shoulders and shaking him. What the fuck did you see?" "Wolf," John managed, his throat dry, his tongue feeling like a dead thing in his mouth. "Big, too big, wrong legs, wrong eyes, wrong everything." "We need to go," Derek repeated, but he wasn't moving toward the door anymore. He was pressed against the far wall, as far from every window as he could get, his hands covering his face. "We need to go, we need to go, we need to go." "We can't go out there," John said. "Not while it's out there, not while it knows we're here." "Then what do we do?" Priya sobbed. "What do we do?" John didn't have an answer. He had stories, fragments of memory from childhood, warnings whispered by elders who had learned the hard way that some doors, once opened, could never be closed. But he didn't have a plan. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have anything except 4 frightened people in a wooden box in the middle of a forest that had gone silent, and the growing certainty that the thing outside was in no hurry because it had all the time in the world. They huddled together through the night, taking turns dozing fitfully while the others kept watch, but none of them really slept. The tapping continued at irregular intervals, sometimes from above, sometimes from the sides, sometimes from behind them where the bathroom window opened onto a sheer drop to the ravine below. At one point, around 3 in the morning, Marcus swore he heard a woman's voice calling his name from the direction of the outhouse, soft and pleading. "Marcus, help me, I'm hurt, come find me." And only John's hand clamped over his mouth prevented him from answering. They found Marcus's phone the next morning, the screen cracked but functional, and in the photo gallery were 17 pictures that none of them remembered taking, pictures of them sleeping, taken from angles that should have been impossible, their faces slack and vulnerable, a dark blur at the edge of each frame that might have been a hand or a paw or something else entirely. Dawn came eventually, gray and anemic, and with it came the false hope that daylight might offer some protection. John pulled back the curtains with shaking hands, expecting to see the wolf still pressed against the glass, but the meadow was empty, the forest beyond it silent and seemingly normal. No tracks in the dew, no sign that anything had stood outside their window during the night. Just the pine trees and the morning mist and the distant sound of a woodpecker that John almost wept to hear. They made a plan over cold granola bars and lukewarm water. Marcus would take the Subaru and drive to the nearest town, 30 miles of dirt road and then another 40 of 2-lane highway, to get help, to find a phone that worked, to bring back the police or the forest rangers or anyone with a gun, and an authority that didn't depend on Navajo taboos. The rest of them would stay at the cabin, barricade themselves inside, and wait. It wasn't a good plan. It relied on the assumption that the creature only hunted at night, that daylight offered some kind of protection, that the road would be passable, and the car would start, and Marcus wouldn't be intercepted somewhere between here and civilization. But it was the only plan they had, and clinging to it was better than facing the alternative. Marcus left at mid-morning, the Subaru's engine turning over with a reassuring roar that seemed to drive back some of the shadows. John watched him go from the porch, waving until the car disappeared around the first bend, and then he turned back to the cabin with a sinking feeling that he couldn't name, a premonition that had nothing to do with his grandmother's stories and everything to do with the basic mathematics of survival. There were 3 of them left now, and every hour that passed was an hour closer to nightfall. The day passed with excruciating slowness, each minute stretched into an eternity of listening. They took turns napping, but sleep brought no relief. John dreamed of running through the forest, pursued by something that wore his own face, and he woke gasping to find Priya shaking him, her eyes wide with terror. "You were talking in your sleep," she said. You were saying my name, but it wasn't you. I looked at you and your mouth wasn't moving, but I heard your voice from outside the window, saying my name, saying come outside, it's safe now." John sat up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The afternoon light was fading, and the cabin felt smaller than it had that morning, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. "Where's Derek?" "I don't know. He said he was going to the outhouse. That was 20 minutes ago." They found Derek standing at the tree line, 50 feet from the cabin, staring into the forest with a blank, trance-like expression that made John's skin crawl. When they called to him, he didn't turn. When John grabbed his shoulder and spun him around, Derek's face was wet with tears, and his mouth moved in a silent rhythm, as if he were having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. "She sounded so real," Derek whispered when he finally focused on John's face. "Your mother, she sounded exactly like your mother. She said she was lost in the woods, that she had fallen and hurt her ankle, that she needed help. I heard her from the outhouse. She said she was cold, John. She said she was so cold." "My mother is in Phoenix," John said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening in his chest. "She's been in Phoenix for 3 years. She wasn't here last night, and she's not in those woods now." "But I heard her," Derek insisted, and his eyes were wild, the eyes of a man whose grip on reality had been loosened by something that understood exactly which threads to pull. "I heard her voice. How could I hear her voice?" "Because it wasn't her," John said. "It was never her. It was the thing that you invited. And it's not just wearing animal skins anymore, Derek. It's wearing our voices. It's wearing our memories. It's learning us piece by piece, and it's using what it learns to get closer." They dragged Derek back to the cabin, and he didn't resist, but John noticed that his friend's eyes kept drifting back to the tree line, searching for something, and John wondered what Derek had seen in the forest, what promise had been whispered in his mother's voice that had drawn him away from safety. He wondered if the Skinwalker had shown Derek something else too, something tailored specifically to his weaknesses, his guilts, his fears. The thought that the creature was not just hunting them but studying them, that it was approaching this massacre with the patience of a scholar and the creativity of an artist, made John want to vomit. They locked the doors again. They checked the windows. They piled furniture against the weak points and told themselves that the barriers would hold, that help was coming, that Marcus would return with lights and sirens and the blessed, rational authority of the state. But the sun kept falling, and the shadows kept lengthening, and when dusk finally painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and arterial red, John knew with a dread that went beyond fear into a kind of terrible acceptance that Marcus was not coming back. Marcus had driven into the forest, and the forest had swallowed him, and the only question that remained was whether Marcus was already dead or whether he was still alive somewhere, kept as bait, as a lure, as a voice that the creature could use to call the rest of them out. The tapping started again at full dark. This time it was not alone. From the basement, a dirt-floored cellar that John had explored that afternoon and found empty except for old canning jars and cobwebs, came the sound of a baby crying. Not a recording, not a stray cat. The real, heart-wrenching sound of an infant in distress, the kind of sound that bypasses rational thought and goes straight to the deepest, most primitive part of the human brain. Priya was on her feet before John could stop her, her face transformed by a maternal instinct that the creature had clearly anticipated. "There's no baby," John said, grabbing her arm as she moved toward the cellar door. "Priya, listen to me. There is no baby. This cabin has been empty for months. There is no baby in the basement." "But I hear it," Priya sobbed, pulling against his grip. "I hear it crying. We can't just leave it. We can't just let it cry." "It's not real. It's using your kindness against you. Please, Priya, please don't go down there." She looked at him, and for a moment he saw the war in her eyes, the battle between what she knew intellectually and what she felt in her bones, the ancient programming that told her to protect the vulnerable at any cost. Then the crying stopped, and in the silence that followed they heard something else. Footsteps on the cellar stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps ascending from the darkness below. Priya screamed, a sound that seemed to satisfy the house itself because the footsteps stopped, and then a new sound began, a wet, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across dirt, moving from the cellar stairs toward the door that separated the basement from the main floor. Upstairs, John commanded, pushing Priya toward the loft ladder. Now, Derek, move. They scrambled up the ladder, John last, pulling the wooden slat up behind him and wedging it into place with shaking hands. The loft was a single room with a low, slanted ceiling and one round window that faced the forest. There was nowhere else to go. If the thing came up the ladder, they would have to go out the window, and the drop to the ground was 20 feet onto hard-packed earth and scattered pine cones. The dragging sound continued below them, moving in circles around the main room, pausing occasionally as if listening. Then it stopped directly beneath the loft, and John felt the floorboards vibrate with the impact of something being dropped. A thud, then another, then a sound like fabric being unwrapped. "What's it doing?" Derek whispered. "I don't know," John said. "Don't look, don't make a sound." But Priya was already looking. She had crawled to the edge of the loft and was peering through the gap between two floorboards, her face pale in the moonlight that filtered through the round window. John saw her expression change, saw the color drain from her face, saw her mouth open in a silent scream, saw her hands come up to cover her eyes. Then she was making a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a wail, a sound of pure, unfiltered horror that went on, until John clamped his hand over her mouth and dragged her away from the edge. "What did you see?" he demanded, shaking her. "Priya, what did you see?" She couldn't speak. She just pointed, her finger trembling like a divining rod, and John crawled to the gap and looked down into the main room below. The thing in the center of the floor was a bundle, roughly the size of a human head, wrapped in what looked like animal fur. But the fur was not clean. It was matted with something dark and wet, and as John watched, the bundle shifted, unfurling like a flower made of meat and bone. Inside was a clump of hair, long, black, unmistakably human hair, still attached to a piece of scalp that glistened in the moonlight. And wrapped around it, arranged with a care that was almost tender, was a coyote pelt, fresh enough that John could smell the copper scent of blood from 20 feet above. But the worst part was the note. There was no paper, no writing. The message was written in something dark on the wooden floorboards, 3 symbols that John recognized with a sinking heart as Navajo words, the kind of warning that had been used for centuries to mark cursed ground, to designate a place where the natural order had been violated. It was a signature, a claim of ownership. The Skinwalker was not just hunting them, it was gifting them. It was leaving offerings the way a cat leaves dead mice on a doorstep, the way a suitor leaves flowers. And the message was clear: you are already mine. They stayed in the loft until dawn, none of them sleeping, none of them speaking. When the first gray light began to filter through the round window, John crept down the ladder and found the main room empty, the bundle gone, the floorboards wiped clean. But the smell remained, the smell of blood and fur and something else, something that John would later identify as the smell of a human body that had been living inside an animal skin for too long, the smell of sweat and musk and spiritual rot. Derek was the first to break. He stood in the center of the room, staring at the clean floorboards, and he began to laugh. It was not a happy sound. It was the laugh of a man who had looked into the abyss and found it looking back with his own eyes. "It was a bear," Derek said between giggles that sounded like sobs. "It was a guy in a bear costume, like those creepy videos online. Someone's playing a prank. It's a prank. It has to be a prank." "Derek," John started, but his friend spun on him with a ferocity that was as sudden as it was frightening. "Don't," Derek shouted. "Don't you dare tell me it's real. Don't you dare tell me that thing is supernatural. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in demons. I don't believe in your grandmother's fairy tales. It's a man in a suit. It's a psycho with a costume. And when Marcus comes back with the police, we're going to find out exactly who it is, and we're going to press charges, and we're going to sue them for every penny they have, and we're going to laugh about this at parties for the rest of our lives." "Marcus isn't coming back," John said quietly. Derek's laughter died. "What?" Marcus isn't coming back. The car would have reached the highway by yesterday afternoon. If he had made it, help would have been here by now. The nearest ranger station is 40 miles, but there are houses after 15. There are phones. There are people. If Marcus had made it, someone would have come. So he's lost, he's stuck, the car broke down. Or he's dead, or he's something worse than dead. Derek stared at him, and John saw the last of his friend's rationalism crumbling like dry sand, falling away to reveal the terrified child underneath. "What do we do?" Derek whispered. "John, what do we do?" "We find my uncle's truck," John said. "There's an old pickup in the shed behind the cabin. It probably hasn't been started in months, but it's our only chance. We get in, we drive, and we don't stop until we're in a town with streetlights and a police station." "What about Marcus?" Priya asked. She had come down from the loft, her face pale but her voice steady, as if she had passed through some threshold of fear into a numb acceptance. "We can't just leave him." "Marcus is gone," John said, and the words tasted like ash. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but Marcus is gone, and if we stay here trying to find him, we'll all be gone too. The Skinwalker. It doesn't hunt because it's hungry. It hunts because we noticed it. We saw it. We spoke its name. And now it has to erase us to keep it secret. That's what it does. That's what it's always done. It's not an animal. It's not a monster. It's a person. A person who made a choice, and that choice has a cost, and the cost is that no one can know what they are." "A person," Priya repeated, and something in her face shifted, a new understanding dawning. "You mean, it's human underneath?" "It was human," John said. "Once. My grandmother told me stories about a man from our own community who was cast out decades ago. A medicine man who wanted more power than the songs could give him. He broke every taboo, killed his own kin, wore their skins. The stories say he still walks these mountains, still wears the pelts, still maintains the disguise. Because if people knew what he was, if they knew that becoming a skinwalker was possible, that the door was open to anyone hateful enough to walk through it. Then others might try," Derek finished, his voice hollow. "He's not hunting us because we're trespassing. He's hunting us because we might tell someone, because we might prove that he's real." "Yes," John said, "and that makes him more dangerous than any monster, because he knows what we know, he thinks like us, he plans like us, and he's had decades to get very, very good at making people disappear." They gathered what they could: water, a flashlight, a hunting knife from the kitchen drawer that felt laughably inadequate against what they had seen. The truck was in the shed, just as John remembered, an old Ford from the 80s with rust around the wheel wells and a cracked windshield. John found the keys hanging on a nail above the workbench, and when he turned the ignition, the engine coughed and sputtered and then roared to life with a sound that was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. They piled in, Derek in the passenger seat, Priya in the back, and John put the truck in drive and steered toward the dirt road that led away from the cabin, away from the forest, away from the nightmare. The truck bounced over ruts and rocks, and John drove faster than was safe, faster than was wise, because every instinct told him that the creature was still out there, still watching, still waiting for the perfect moment. They were 2 miles from the cabin when they found the Subaru. It was parked at an angle across the road, its doors open, its interior dark. John stopped the truck and stared at it, his hands frozen on the wheel, his heart a cold stone in his chest. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just the empty car, sitting in the middle of the dirt road as if Marcus had stopped for a moment and stepped out and simply vanished. "Don't stop," Priya whispered from the back seat. "John, don't stop, keep driving." But John was already opening his door, already stepping out into the afternoon light, already moving toward the Subaru with a hope that he knew was foolish but couldn't suppress. "Marcus," he called. "Marcus, are you here?" The forest answered with silence. Then from somewhere to the left, from somewhere deep in the pines, came a sound that made John's blood run cold. Marcus's voice, perfectly replicated, calling back to him. "John, over here. I found something. Come look." John stood frozen at the edge of the road, his feet rooted to the earth by a terror that transcended the physical. It was Marcus's voice. Every inflection, every cadence, the slight upward lilt at the end of sentences that Marcus had developed during his years in California. It was perfect. It was impossible. And it was coming from a direction where there was nothing but forest and shadow and the patient, watching darkness. "John," the voice called again, and now it sounded closer, as if Marcus were moving toward him through the trees. "Hurry, it's important." "John, get back in the truck," Derek said from the passenger window, his voice high and tight. "John, please, that's not Marcus. You know that's not Marcus." "John," the voice called a third time, and this time there was an edge to it, a hint of impatience, of hunger. "Why aren't you coming? Don't you want to see what I found?" John took a step backward, then another. His hand found the door of the truck, and he pulled himself inside, his movements mechanical, his mind screaming. He put the truck in drive and floored the accelerator, the wheels spinning in the dirt for a heart-stopping moment before catching and launching them forward. The Subaru receded in the rearview mirror, and John didn't look at it, didn't look at the tree line where something moved in the corner of his vision, something tall and wrong that kept pace with the truck for just a moment before falling behind. They drove for 10 miles before the road forked, and John realized with a sinking heart that he didn't know which way to go. The map on his phone was useless. No signal, no GPS, just a blue dot in a sea of gray. He chose left at random, hoping that the road would eventually lead to pavement, to people, to safety. But the road kept winding, kept narrowing, kept taking them deeper into a forest that seemed to close around them like the walls of a throat. It was Priya who noticed first. "John," she said, her voice barely audible over the engine. "John, look at the dashboard." John looked down. The fuel gauge was dropping. Fast. Too fast. They had started with a quarter tank, enough for 30 miles at least, but the needle was already brushing empty, and John realized with a sick certainty that the tank had been punctured, that something had done this while they were in the cabin, that the Skinwalker had not just been taunting them with sounds and shadows, but had been systematically destroying their means of escape. The truck sputtered, coughed, and died. They coasted to a stop in the middle of the road, surrounded by pines on all sides, and the silence that followed was the most complete John had ever heard. No birds, no wind, just the ticking of the cooling engine and the sound of 3 people breathing in the shared air of a tomb. "We need to walk," John said, but even as he said it, he knew it was hopeless. They were miles from anywhere, dressed in light clothing, with no food and barely any water. The temperature was already dropping as the sun dipped toward the horizon, and the night would bring cold that could kill as surely as any monster. They got out of the truck. They stood in the road, 3 small figures in a vast wilderness, and John felt the weight of their insignificance pressing down on him like a physical force. They were not the heroes of this story. They were not going to defeat the monster with cleverness or courage. They were prey, plain and simple, and the only question that remained was which of them would be the last to fall. "We should stick together," Derek said, and John heard the lie in his voice, heard the calculation. Derek was already planning to run, to separate, to sacrifice the others for his own survival. The hunger had already begun to work on him, not the hunger of the Wendigo, but the simpler, more universal hunger of self-preservation. "Yes," John said, because agreeing was easier than arguing, because he didn't have the strength to fight Derek and the forest and the thing that was watching them from the shadows. "We stick together. We follow the road. We keep moving." They walked. The sun fell lower, painting the sky in shades of blood and bruise, and the shadows grew long and tangled. John kept his eyes on the road ahead, afraid to look at the trees, afraid of what he might see watching from between the trunks. But he couldn't help his peripheral vision, couldn't help catching glimpses of movement that vanished when he turned his head, a flash of fur, a glint of orange red, the suggestion of legs that were too long for any natural anatomy. It was following them, not attacking, just following, herding, waiting for the darkness. And then the darkness came, swift and absolute, and with it came the voices. The voices began as whispers, barely distinguishable from the wind that moved through the pine canopy overhead, but John knew them immediately for what they were. The Skinwalker's latest weapon, the mimicry that had proven so effective in the cabin now turned to a new purpose. From the darkness to their left came Marcus's voice, but it was wrong somehow, stretched and distorted, as if filtered through a throat that had never been designed to form human words. "Guys," it called, "I'm over here, I got lost. Come find me, I'm scared." And from the right, a woman's voice, Priya's own mother, speaking in the exact cadence that Priya had described during late-night conversations in their shared apartment, the particular way she said beta when she was worried, the slight catch in her breath. "Priya, baby, where are you? I've been looking everywhere. Come to mama." Priya made a sound like something breaking inside her chest, and John grabbed her arm with a grip that would leave bruises. "It's not real," he hissed, his voice ragged from exhaustion and terror. "None of it's real. Keep walking. Don't listen. Don't answer." But Derek had stopped. He stood in the middle of the road, his head tilted toward the tree line where Marcus's voice continued to call, and his face was a mask of indecision and desperate hope. "What if it is him?" Derek whispered. "What if Marcus is out there hurt and we're just leaving him?" "Marcus is dead," John said, and the words came out harder than he intended, cruel in their certainty. "Marcus has been dead since yesterday, and that thing is wearing his voice like a pair of borrowed shoes. If you go into those trees, Derek, you will not come back. Do you understand me? You will not come back." Derek turned to look at him, and in the dim moonlight that filtered through the canopy, John saw something shift in his friend's eyes, a flicker of resentment, of blame, of the poison that fear plants in the human heart. "This is your fault," Derek said quietly. "You brought us here. You knew about this thing. You knew the rules and you let me break them, and now Marcus is dead and we're walking in the dark, and it's all because you wanted to show us where you came from. You wanted us to see your roots. Well, congratulations, John. We're seeing them. We're seeing them up close." "Derek, please," John said. But Derek was already backing away, moving toward the tree line, toward the voice that called his name in tones of perfect, desperate friendship. "Marcus," Derek called out. "Marcus, is that you? Stay there, I'm coming." "Derek, no." John lunged forward, but he was too slow, always too slow, and Derek had already stepped off the road and into the shadows of the pines. For a moment John could see him, a pale shape moving between the dark trunks, and then there was a sound like a sack of wet laundry being dragged across gravel, a sound that lasted only seconds but would echo in John's nightmares for the rest of his life, and then there was silence. John stood frozen in the middle of the dirt road, his hands still outstretched, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Priya was pressed against his back, her face buried in his shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. They waited for Derek to reappear, to call out, to laugh at his own gullibility. But the forest swallowed sound as completely as it swallowed light, and there was nothing. No scream, no struggle, just the terrible, patient quiet of a predator that had fed and was now content to wait for its next course. "We have to go," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "Priya, we have to go now, right now." She didn't argue. She didn't speak. She just nodded against his shoulder and took his hand, and together they ran down the road, their feet pounding against the hard-packed dirt, their breath fogging in the cold night air. John didn't know where they were going. He didn't know if the road led anywhere at all. But running felt better than standing still, felt like doing something instead of waiting to die, and he clung to that illusion with the desperation of a drowning man clutching a splintered plank. They ran until Priya stumbled, her ankle turning on a root that had grown across the road like a skeletal finger. She went down hard, her cry of pain cut short by John's hand over her mouth, and he pulled her up, supporting her weight, and they limped together down the endless dark corridor of the forest. Behind them, John heard something moving, not running, not chasing, just following, keeping pace. A rustle of fur against bark, a soft impact of feet that were not shaped like human feet, a breathing that was too deep, too wet, too full of anticipation. And then the voice came again, but this time it was not Marcus's voice, not Priya's mother, not any voice that John had heard before. It was his own voice, speaking from directly behind them, close enough that he could feel the breath on the back of his neck, though there was nothing there when he spun around. "John," it said, and the intonation was perfect, the exact way he said his own name when he was tired, when he was talking to himself in the mirror, when he was trying to convince himself that everything was going to be okay. "John, stop running. You're only making it worse. Stop running and let me show you what I am. Let me show you what you could become." John ran faster, dragging Priya with him, and the voice laughed, his own laugh, the one he used when he was uncomfortable, the short, barking chuckle that he had always hated. "You can't outrun me, John. I know these woods better than you know your own apartment. I've been walking them since before you were born. I've worn the skins of 100 animals, and I'll wear yours too, and when I do, I'll know everything you know. I'll visit your grandmother. I'll sit in her hogan and drink her tea and wear your face while I tell her how much I love her. And she'll never know. She'll die believing that her grandson came home." "Stop it," John screamed, the sound tearing his throat raw. "Stop it." "Make me," the voice whispered, and now it was beside him, though there was nothing in the moonlight but empty road and shadow. "Make me stop, John, but you can't, can you? Because you don't have the power. Because you turned your back on the old ways, and the old ways don't help those who don't believe. You wanted to be modern. You wanted to be scientific. You wanted to study your own people like they were specimens in a jar. And now you're going to die like a modern man, confused, alone, and screaming at a darkness that doesn't care about your degrees." Priya let out a sound that might have been a word or might have been the last of her sanity fraying, and she pulled away from John, running ahead of him down the road, her injured ankle forgotten in a surge of adrenaline-fueled panic. John called after her, but she didn't stop, didn't slow, and he watched her disappear around a bend in the road, her white shirt a ghostly blur against the darkness, and then he heard her scream. It was a short scream, not like the movies, not the prolonged wail of a victim in a slasher film. Just a single, sharp sound, cut off by something wet and final, and then there was silence again, the silence that John was beginning to understand was the Skinwalker's true signature, the way it signed its work. He was alone now, truly alone, and the voice was back, but it was different this time. It was not his own voice, it was his father's. "Jonathan," it said, and the word sent a shock through John's body that made him stumble and fall to his knees in the dirt. His father had been dead for 12 years, killed in a trucking accident on I-40, and John had not heard that voice since he was 14 years old, since the funeral where his mother had held him too tight and his grandmother had sung the songs that prepared the dead for their journey. But it was unmistakable, the deep, gravelly tone, the slight hitch on the J sound, the way his father had always said his full name when he was disappointed, when he was trying to teach a lesson that John didn't want to learn. "Dad," John whispered, and even as he said it, he knew it was a mistake, knew that answering the voice was the first step toward surrender, but he couldn't help it. The grief that surged through him was as fresh and sharp as it had been on the day of the funeral, and the tears that streamed down his face were not tears of fear, but of a loss that had never healed, a wound that the Skinwalker had found and was now probing with cruel precision. "You should have listened to your grandmother, Jonathan," the voice said, and it was closer now, close enough that John could smell it, the smell of old leather and road dust, and the cheap aftershave his father had always worn, mixed with something else, something that rotted beneath the familiar scents like meat left too long in the sun. "You should have learned the songs. You should have stayed with your people, but you wanted to run. You wanted to be one of them. The white-educated Indians who think they can escape their blood by filling their heads with white ideas. And now look at you, on your knees in the dirt, your friends dead, your pride broken, Just another Indian who thought he was too smart for the old ways. "You're not my father," John sobbed, his hands pressed against the cold earth. "You're not him. You're a thing that wears dead people's voices. You're a person who killed other people to get power. You're not supernatural. You're just a murderer in a costume." The voice laughed, and it was his father's laugh, the deep belly laugh that had filled their small house on Christmas mornings, and the sound of it coming from whatever stood in the darkness made John want to tear his own ears off. "A murderer in a costume," the voice repeated, amused. "Is that what I am, Jonathan? Is that all? Then why are you crying? Why are you shaking? Why does your soul know me for what I am even if your educated mind won't admit it?" Something stepped into the moonlight. It was not the wolf. It was not the coyote. It was a bear or something wearing a bear's skin, and the proportions were so wrong that John's mind rebelled against the image, tried to reject what his eyes were showing him. The bear stood on two legs, but its gait was not the shambling, rolling walk of a natural bear. It was the gait of a human being, a man walking inside a suit that didn't fit, and the skin hung loose in places and was stretched too tight in others, revealing patches of pale human flesh beneath the fur. The head was the worst part. The bear's skull had been hollowed out, and the face that peered through the eye holes was a man's face, but it was wrong, stretched and compressed to fit inside the animal's cranium, the eyes too wide, the mouth too small, the nose flattened against the bone. The creature raised its arms, and John heard the sound that would haunt him until the day he died. The wet, tearing sound of bones snapping and resetting, of joints dislocating and reforming, of a human body forcing itself into shapes that evolution had never intended. The bear's forelimbs elongated, the paws splitting to reveal fingers that were too long and had too many joints, and the Skinwalker took a step forward, and another, and John saw that beneath the bear pelt, it wore other skins, a coyote pelt around its waist, a deer hide draped over its shoulders, a rabbit fur tied around its neck like a scarf. It was a collage of death, a walking museum of every animal it had killed and worn, and the weight of those skins seemed to slow it down, to make its movements jerky and deliberate, but it did not stop. "The door is open, Jonathan," his father's voice said from the bear's mouth, which didn't move, which couldn't move because the bear's jaw was sewn shut, and the words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The door has always been open. Anyone can walk through. All it takes is the willingness to do what must be done, to kill what must be killed, to wear what must be worn." Your friend Derek understood at the end. He understood that survival is the only morality that matters. He walked through the door before he died, and I wore him for a while, and now I know his thoughts, his fears, his delicious little doubts. Would you like to hear what he thought of you, Jonathan? Would you like to know how much he blamed you? "Shut up," John whispered, but he couldn't look away from the thing in front of him, couldn't stop cataloging the details. The way the bear's fur was matted with old blood, the way the human fingers beneath the pawskin were tipped with nails that had been filed to points, the way the creature's chest heaved with the effort of maintaining a shape that nature had never intended. "He thought you were a coward," the voice continued, relentless. "He thought you brought him here to punish him for being white, for being educated, for being everything you secretly wished you could be. He thought you wanted him to die, Jonathan. He thought you planned this. And maybe he's right. Maybe some part of you, the part that still speaks Navajo in your dreams, the part that still remembers the songs your grandmother sang, maybe that part wanted to teach him a lesson, to show him that the old ways weren't just stories. Well, congratulations, son. He's learned, and so will you." The Skinwalker lunged. It was faster than John had expected, faster than any creature wearing that many layers of dead skin should have been, and John threw himself sideways, rolling across the dirt road and into the ditch on the far side. He felt the wind of its passage, smelled the rot and musk of its presence, and he was up and running before his mind had fully processed that he was still alive. He ran through the trees, branches whipping his face, roots tripping his feet, and behind him he heard the thing following, not running but loping, moving with a horrible economy of motion that covered ground faster than his panicked sprint. He burst into a clearing, and for a moment he thought he had found salvation. There was a structure ahead, a small building, and as he stumbled toward it, he realized with a surge of desperate hope that it was his uncle's cabin. He had run in a circle. He was back where he had started, and that meant the truck was nearby, and maybe, just maybe, the creature hadn't thought to sabotage the other vehicle. He reached the cabin's porch and threw himself against the door, which swung open, unlocked, which was wrong because he had locked it when they left, and he fell inside, slamming the door behind him and fumbling for the bolt. His fingers found the lock, slid it home, and he backed away from the door, gasping, his eyes scanning the room for anything he could use as a weapon. The cabin was different. It had changed in the hours since they had left it, transformed from a rustic hunting lodge into something that looked like the den of an animal. Pelts hung from the walls, coyote, deer, rabbit, wolf, bear, dozens of them, arranged in patterns that made John's eyes water to follow. The floor was covered in bones, small bones from birds and rodents, larger bones from deer and dogs, and in the center of the room, arranged in a circle around the cold fireplace, were the human remains. John recognized Marcus's watch, still attached to a wrist that had been separated from its owner. He recognized Priya's hair, the distinctive auburn highlights that she had paid a fortune for in a Scottsdale salon, now clumped and matted with blood on the floor. He recognized Derek's Patagonia vest, the one he had been so proud of, now torn and stained and draped over the back of a chair like a discarded costume. And on the mantelpiece, arranged with the care of a museum curator, were the skins. Not the animal skins that hung on the walls. These were different. These were fresher. These were still wet. John vomited. He couldn't help it. His body rejected the reality of what he was seeing, tried to expel the horror through his mouth, and he retched until his stomach was empty, and his throat was raw, and his eyes streamed with tears that he couldn't control. When he was done, when he was empty, he wiped his mouth with a trembling hand and looked around the room with a new understanding. The Skinwalker didn't just wear animal skins. It collected them. It displayed them. It had turned this cabin into a trophy room, a monument to every life it had taken, every form it had assumed, every soul it had erased. And John understood something else too, something that made his blood run cold with a new kind of fear. The creature was not just hunting them because they had spoken its name. It was hunting them because it was bored. It had been alive for decades, maybe longer, surviving on the margins of the world, and it craved novelty. It craved the challenge of intelligent prey. It craved the game. And John was the last player. The door began to shake. Not a knock, not a scratch. A rhythmic, deliberate pounding, as if something very large and very strong were testing the strength of the wood, searching for weak points. John backed toward the fireplace, his mind racing through possibilities, through stories, through fragments of half-remembered conversations with elders who had spoken of these things in hushed voices around winter fires. The Skinwalker's power came from the skins. That was what the stories said. The transformation, the mimicry, the ability to move between forms, it was all tied to the pelts. Without the skins, the creature was just a person. A strong person, a fast person, a person who had done terrible things, but just a person who could burn. John looked at the fireplace. The fire had gone out when they left, but the ashes were still warm, and there was a stack of split pine beside the hearth, and a box of kitchen matches on the mantelpiece. And hanging on the wall above the fireplace, directly over his head, was the Skinwalker's collection. The freshest, most important skins, the ones it wore most often, the ones that held the most power. The pounding on the door intensified, and John heard the wood begin to splinter. He didn't have much time. He grabbed the matches, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped the first two, and on the third try, he managed to strike one against the box. The flame flared to life, tiny and orange and impossibly fragile, and John held it to the pile of kindling in the fireplace, blowing gently until the dry pine caught and began to burn. The door shattered. The Skinwalker stepped through, and it was not wearing the bare skin anymore. It was wearing Derek's face. Not a mask, not an approximation. Derek's actual face, stretched and fitted over the creature's own skull, the skin pale and bloodless where it had been peeled away from the underlying muscle. The eyes Derek's eyes, but wrong, too bright, too aware. The mouth moving in a smile that Derek had never made in life. "John," it said in Derek's voice, "why are you hiding? I thought we were friends. I thought you wanted to show me your world." John didn't answer. He was feeding the fire, piling pine onto the flames until they roared up the chimney, until the heat began to fill the room and the smoke began to sting his eyes. The Skinwalker, wearing Derek's face, Derek's hands, Derek's clothes, took another step into the room, and the smile faltered as it felt the heat. "You're making it worse," the creature said, and now the voice was shifting, sliding between Derek and Marcus and Priya and John's father, a cacophony of stolen voices that grated against John's sanity like nails on a chalkboard. "If you burn this place, you burn everything. The evidence, the proof. No one will ever believe you. They'll think you killed them. They'll think you're insane." "I don't care," John said, and his voice was steady now, calm in a way that surprised him, the calm of a man who had accepted his own death and was only concerned with taking his enemy with him. "I don't care what they believe. I don't care if they lock me up. I just care that you don't get to wear my face. I just care that you don't get to visit my grandmother and drink her tea and make her think her grandson came home." He grabbed the edge of the nearest pelt, the coyote skin, the one that hung closest to the fire, and he threw it into the flames. The reaction was immediate and terrible. The Skinwalker let out a sound that was not a scream but something deeper, something that seemed to shake the foundations of the cabin, a sound of rage and pain and a terrible, ancient fear. The Derek face began to sag, to slide, the stolen skin losing its grip as the power that sustained it was consumed by the fire. The creature lunged toward the fireplace, its two long arms reaching for the burning pelt, and John grabbed another skin, the deer hide, the wolf fur, the rabbit pelt, and he threw them all into the flames, one after another, until the fireplace was a roaring inferno, and the room was filled with the smell of burning hair and cooking meat. The Skinwalker collapsed. The stolen faces melted away, sliding off like wax from a candle, revealing the thing beneath. And the thing beneath was worse than any monster, worse than any animal, because it was human. It was a man, old and shriveled and covered in scars that looked like they had been self-inflicted, ritual marks carved into pale flesh that had not seen the sun in decades. The creature's true body was emaciated, barely more than skin and bone, but the eyes were the same burning orange red that John had seen in the wolf's face, and they fixed on him with a hatred that was older than nations. "You," the thing rasped, its voice now just a voice, thin and dry and unmistakably human. "You think you've won. You think burning my skin stops me. I can get more skins. I can always get more skins, but you've seen me, you know my face. And I know yours. I will wear you, Jonathan, so. I will walk in your skin until your grandmother dies in my arms, and I will sing her the songs she sang to you, and she will die believing that her grandson has come home to stay." John picked up the burning log from the fireplace. It was heavy, and the heat scorched his palms, but he held it with both hands and swung it with all the strength he had left. The log connected with the creature's head with a wet, crunching sound, and the Skinwalker, the man, fell backward, its orange-red eyes rolling up, its shriveled body convulsing. John hit it again, and again, and again, until the log broke and the thing on the floor stopped moving and the cabin was filled with smoke and the smell of burning hair, and he couldn't tell if he was crying or laughing or screaming. He stumbled out of the cabin, the fire behind him now, spreading to the walls, consuming the pelts, erasing the evidence of decades of horror. He ran into the forest, away from the flames, away from the thing he had killed, and he ran until his legs gave out and he fell to the ground in a small clearing where the first gray light of dawn was beginning to filter through the trees. He lay there for hours, consciousness fading in and out, his body shivering with shock and cold, and the delayed reaction of a nervous system that had been pushed beyond its limits. When he finally managed to stand, when he finally began to walk again, the sun was high and the forest was normal, full of birdsong and the rustle of small animals, and the road, when he found it, led to a highway, and the highway led to a gas station where a woman in a flannel shirt looked at him with wide eyes and called 911. The police found the cabin burned to the ground, the remains of 3 of John's friends recovered from the ashes, and the body of an unidentified man nearby, burned beyond recognition, his bones showing signs of deformities that the coroner couldn't explain. John told them everything, the skinwalker, the pelts, the mimicry, the voices, and they wrote it down with the patient, professional detachment of people who had heard worse delusions and would hear worse still. He was sedated, hospitalized, questioned by psychiatrists who spoke to him in the gentle tones they reserved for the broken and the mad. He never told them about the thing he had seen in the firelight in the moment before the creature died. He never told them that beneath the stolen skins, beneath the scars and the shriveled flesh, he had recognized the face, not from childhood stories, not from elder warnings. He had recognized it from photographs in his grandmother's house, from the family album she kept in a cedar box beneath her bed. The skinwalker had been Atso, a disgraced member of his own family, cast out before John was born, erased from the family tree but not from memory. The face had been his great-uncle's face, distorted by decades of dark medicine and spiritual corruption, but unmistakably related to the man who smiled in the black and white photos from the 1970s, holding a sheep and squinting against the sun. He never told them because some truths were worse than madness. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed, and some family secrets were meant to burn. He was released eventually, after months of psychiatric evaluation, after his mother had flown in from Phoenix and cried and held him and told him that none of it was his fault, after the police had closed the case and attributed the deaths to a person or persons unknown, and moved on to fresher horrors. He moved back to the city, to a small apartment in Flagstaff, and he tried to rebuild a life that had been shattered by something he couldn't explain to his therapists, couldn't describe to his friends, couldn't even fully process in his own mind. He changed his major from anthropology to social work. He stopped going home for holidays. He learned to sleep with the lights on and the television playing static, because silence had become unbearable, because every creak of the building, every rustle of wind against the window carried the possibility of a voice that shouldn't exist. He learned to live with the weight of survival, the crushing guilt of being the one who made it out when everyone else had died. And he learned that the hardest part of being a soul survivor was not the trauma, but the loneliness of a truth that no one else would ever believe. A year later, on the anniversary of the night it happened, John found himself on a gurney in the back of an ambulance. He didn't remember how he had gotten there. The paramedics told him he had been found wandering on the highway outside the reservation, catatonic and unresponsive, his feet bare and bleeding from miles of walking. They told him he had been muttering something in Navajo, something they couldn't understand, and when they asked him where he had been, what had happened, he just closed his eyes and shook his head. He was being driven to the hospital in Flagstaff, the IV in his arm dripping saline and sedatives, the ambulance swaying gently on the highway that cut through the pine forest. He stared at the ceiling, counting the rivets in the metal panels, trying to anchor himself in the present moment, in the reality of fluorescent lights and beeping machines and the impersonal competence of medical professionals. And then he looked out the window. The ambulance was passing through a stretch of forest that looked familiar, that felt familiar in a way that made his stomach clench with remembered terror. And at the edge of the tree line, sitting perfectly still in the early morning light, was a fox. It was small, no bigger than a house cat, with reddish fur and a white chest and a tail that was too bushy for its body. But its proportions were wrong. Its legs were too long. Its eyes were not the dark brown of a normal fox, but a burning, sickly orange red that seemed to glow with an inner light. And it was watching the ambulance. Not running, not hunting, just watching. As the ambulance passed, the fox turned its head to follow John's gaze, and John saw its lips pull back in a smile. Not an animal expression, a human expression, deliberate and knowing and full of terrible, patient promise. John closed his eyes. He didn't open them again until the ambulance reached the hospital, until the doors swung open and the light of the emergency room washed over him in a wave of sterile white. He didn't tell the paramedics what he had seen. He didn't tell the doctors. He didn't tell anyone. But that night in his hospital bed, with the monitors beeping softly and the night nurse dozing at her station, John whispered a promise into the darkness. He promised himself that he would never speak the name again. He promised himself that he would never return to those mountains, never visit his grandmother's hogan, never again invite the darkness to notice him. He promised himself that he would live the rest of his life in the light, in the cities, in the safe places where the old ways were just stories and the monsters were just metaphors. And as he drifted into a drugged, dreamless sleep, he thought he heard a voice from somewhere far away, somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing, whispering back to him in perfect imitation of his own tone. "I heard that, Jonathan. I heard your promise, and I'll be waiting when you break it." He never went back. He never spoke the name. He lived for another 40 years, a quiet life of service and solitude, and when he died, it was in a nursing home in Tucson, surrounded by people who knew nothing of his past, nothing of the night that had defined him. The official cause of death was heart failure. The unofficial cause, whispered by the aide who found him, was that he had died with his eyes wide open, staring at the corner of the room with an expression of such profound terror that it took 3 orderlies to close his eyelids. And outside, in the courtyard of the nursing home, among the carefully tended roses and the paved walkways, a small fox sat watching the window of room 412 until the body was removed, and then it stood on its 2 long legs and walked away into the desert morning, patient and eternal and endlessly hungry. The Vespers of Bone. The first thing Father Kaido noticed about the corpse was that it looked like it had been peeled. The body of old Matsui Yujiro, who had succumbed to the wasting fever 3 nights prior, lay upon the wooden preparation slab in the temple courtyard, bathed in the cold, indifferent light of a full moon that hung like a watching eye over the crumbling pagoda roofs of Kurohata-dera. Father Kaido had risen from his thin mattress in the monks' quarters at the stroke of midnight, unable to sleep, driven by a sensation he could not name, a creeping dread that had settled behind his sternum like a stone dropped into still water. He had shuffled through the darkened corridors in his worn straw sandals, his breath pluming in the frigid mountain air, intending only to verify that the body was properly prepared for the morning's funerary rites. What he found stopped his heart as surely as if a fist had closed around it. Matsui Yujiro had not merely been stripped of his funeral robes, he had been stripped of everything that made him recognizably human. The skin was gone, removed with surgical precision, peeled away in long, curling ribbons that lay scattered across the courtyard stones like discarded parchment. The muscles beneath had been meticulously separated from the bone, layer by layer, each fiber catalogued and laid aside with an almost scholarly attention to detail. The tendons glistened in the moonlight, pale and wet, arranged in neat geometric patterns around the central horror of the skeleton, which remained largely intact, grinning up at the sky with teeth that seemed, in the silvery light, to be laughing. But it was the absence of blood that made Father Kaido's knees buckle and his hand claw at the weathered doorframe for support. There should have been blood, gallons of it, pools of it, rivers of it cascading across the flagstones and into the cracked earth of the courtyard garden. Instead, the stones were dry, coated only with a fine, chalky residue, as white as funeral ash, that puffed up in tiny clouds when the night breeze stirred through the ruined cloisters. Father Kaito stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mouth open in a silent scream that his throat refused to voice, his eyes tracking the impossible neatness of the butchery, the way the internal organs had been arranged in a spiral pattern radiating outward from the sternum, each one desiccated and shrunken as if all moisture had been leached from them in an instant. The liver sat near the left foot, blackened and shriveled like a dried plum. The lungs, deflated and papery, rested by the right hand. The heart, still in its pericardial sac, had been placed with obscene tenderness upon the dead man's exposed skull, positioned where a crown might rest. Father Kaito's hand found the prayer beads at his waist, the smooth wooden orbs clicking together with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating silence of the courtyard, and he began to mouth the Nembutsu, the invocation to emit a Buddha, though the words tasted like dust on his tongue. He backed away slowly, his sandals scraping against the chalky residue, each step releasing a small puff of the white powder that clung to his robes and settled upon his skin with a dry, cold touch. When he reached the interior of the temple, he barred the heavy oak doors with trembling hands and leaned against them, sliding down to the floor, his chest heaving with breaths that came too fast and too shallow, his mind refusing to process what his eyes had witnessed. The temple of Kurohata-dera, perched upon the slopes of Mount Kuroishi like a decaying tooth in an ancient jaw, had served the village below for 7 centuries as a place of prayer, meditation, and more practically, as the final resting place for the dead. The village of Kurohata, a collection of perhaps 200 souls huddled against the merciless winters of the Japanese Alps, had always been a place of hardship, but the past year had brought a suffering that bordered on the biblical. The crops had failed in succession, the rice paddies yielding only stunted blackened stalks, the vegetable gardens producing tubers that turned to slime in the cellar, the fruit trees dropping their leaves in midsummer and standing bare and skeletal against the sky. The livestock had followed, cattle dropping in their stalls, their eyes milky and their tongues swollen, chickens rotting where they stood, feathers falling out in clumps to reveal suppurating sores beneath. And then the people had begun to die. It started with the elderly, as it always did, their bodies weakened by decades of labor and poor nutrition succumbing to a fever that came in the night and took them by morning. But then the fever began to claim the young, the strong, the healthy, the blacksmith's apprentice who could lift an anvil with one hand, the midwife who had delivered 3 generations of Kurohata children, the schoolteacher who had walked 5 miles each day to instruct the village children in the cramped schoolhouse by the river. They died with their skin hot to the touch, their minds raving, their bodies covered in livid purple blotches that spread like spilled ink across their chests and backs. The village doctor, a thin man named Ishikawa who had trained in Tokyo before retreating to the mountains for his health, had exhausted his supply of medicines by the 2nd month and had taken to prescribing prayers and herbal teas that did nothing to stem the tide of death. The temple, with its ancient mortuary chambers carved into the hillside behind the main hall, had become the central hub of village life not through spiritual devotion, but through grim necessity. Bodies arrived daily, sometimes 2 or 3, wrapped in straw mats and carried on wooden biers by surviving family members whose faces were masks of exhaustion and grief. Father Kaito, at 63 years old, had performed more funeral rites in the past 6 months than in the previous 3 decades combined, and his voice, once strong and resonant, had become a cracked whisper that barely carried to the back of the small assembly hall. He had been assisted in his duties by young Ren, a novice monk of 19 years who had arrived at Kurohata-dera 4 years ago, sent by his family from a coastal town to escape the poverty of the fishing villages. Ren was a slight, serious young man with large, dark eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, and a habit of silence that Father Kaito had initially found unsettling, but had come to regard as a mark of genuine spiritual discipline. Ren handled the bodies with a gentleness that belied his youth, washing them with ritual precision, dressing them in the white kimonos of the dead, and placing them in the temporary wooden coffins that were stacked in the temple's underground chambers like cordwood. The mortuary chambers, hewn from the living rock of the mountain in centuries past, were cool and dry, preserving the bodies until the ground thawed enough for burial in the spring. But the chambers were filling up. Father Kaito had counted 47 bodies in the underground vaults, and the rate of death showed no signs of slowing. The village was becoming a necropolis, a settlement of the living surrounded by an ever-growing population of the dead, and the air itself seemed to thicken with the presence of mortality, each breath tasting of incense and decay. It was against this backdrop of relentless death that Father Kaito had discovered the peeled remains of Matsui Yujiro, and as he sat on the floor of the temple interior, his back pressed against the barred door, he realized with a horror that went beyond the immediate shock of the spectacle that this was something new, something that had nothing to do with the fever or the famine. This was an intervention, a desecration that spoke of intelligence and purpose, and an appetite that transcended anything human or natural. He remained there until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the paper screens of the windows, and then, with an effort that seemed to drain the last reserves of his strength, he rose and prepared to face whatever the day would bring. Ren found Father Kaito at dawn, sitting in the main hall before the altar of Amida Buddha, his face gray and his eyes hollow. The older monk had not changed his robes, and the chalky residue from the courtyard still clung to the hem of his black surplice, a pale ghost against the dark fabric. Ren, who had slept fitfully in the small cell adjacent to the kitchen, had woken to a sense of wrongness that he could not articulate, a pressure behind his eyes that made the morning seem somehow darker than it should have been. He had dressed quickly and made his way to the main hall, expecting to find Father Kaito engaged in his usual morning meditation, but instead he found the old monk staring at the gilded statue of the Buddha with an expression that Ren could only describe as terror. "Father," Ren said softly, not wanting to startle the old man, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the small brazier that provided the only warmth in the drafty hall. "Father, what has happened?" Father Kaito turned his head slowly, as if the movement required enormous effort, and his eyes, usually so clear and perceptive, seemed unfocused, staring through Ren rather than at him. "The courtyard," Father Kaito whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Do not go to the courtyard, Ren. Not yet. Not until the sun is higher." But Ren, young and possessed of a curiosity that had not yet been tempered by the wisdom of age, had already moved toward the door, his hand reaching for the heavy iron latch. Father Kaito lunged forward with a speed that surprised them both, his bony hand closing around Ren's wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "No," the old monk said, and there was something in his voice, a raw, desperate edge that Ren had never heard before. "Do not look upon it. Do not let that image into your soul, child. Some things once seen cannot be unseen, and the mind that beholds them is forever changed." Ren froze, his hand still on the latch, feeling the cold metal against his palm and the desperate heat of Father Kaito's fingers against his wrist. He wanted to ask what Father Kaito had seen, what could possibly have reduced this stoic, unflappable man to such a state of gibbering fear, but the words died in his throat as he looked into the old monk's eyes and saw something there that he had never expected to see. The look of a man who had gazed into an abyss and found that it was gazing back. They stood there in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the snapping of the brazier's coals and the distant, muffled crowing of a rooster from the village below. Then slowly Father Kaito released Ren's wrist and turned away, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had settled upon them. "Fetch Hana," he said, his voice returning to something approximating its normal register, though it still trembled slightly at the edges. "The daughter of Tanaka Saburo. Her father's body was brought here 3 days ago, was it not? She will need to be told. And fetch the village elder, Shimada. Tell him. Tell him there has been a desecration. Tell him to bring men. Armed men. Ren nodded, though his mind was racing with questions, and slipped out of the main hall into the pale morning light. The temple complex of Kurohata-dera was a sprawling thing, built in layers across the centuries as successive generations of monks had added wings and halls and chambers to the original structure. The oldest parts, dating back to the Kamakura period, were little more than piles of moss-covered stone and rotting timber, their roofs collapsed inward, their walls overtaken by vines and creeping ivy. The newer sections, constructed in the Edo period, were in better repair, but still showed the signs of decades of neglect: peeling plaster, sagging beams, paper screens patched with scraps of cloth and newspaper. The courtyard where the body lay was in the oldest section, enclosed by crumbling walls and overlooked by the hollow eye sockets of empty windows. Ren made his way along the covered walkway that connected the main hall to the outer gate, his sandals clicking against the wooden planks, and he tried not to look toward the courtyard as he passed. But his eyes, drawn by a morbid curiosity that he could not suppress, flickered sideways, and he caught a glimpse of something pale and irregular through the gaps in the wall, something that his mind refused to process as a human form. He quickened his pace, his heart hammering against his ribs, and emerged from the temple gate onto the narrow dirt path that led down to the village. The morning air was cold and smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the sky above was a clear, brittle blue that seemed to mock the darkness in Ren's heart. He descended the path with the easy stride of a young man accustomed to mountain terrain, passing the terraced fields that clung to the hillside in geometric patches of brown and green, and entered the village proper as the first rays of sunlight began to touch the rooftops. Kurohata was waking slowly, smoke rising from chimneys, doors creaking open as villagers emerged to begin their day's labor. But there was a lethargy to the movements of the people, a listlessness in their gestures, and a dullness in their eyes that spoke of a community worn thin by grief and hardship. Ren passed a group of women drawing water from the communal well, their conversation falling silent as he approached, their eyes following him with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. The monk was a familiar figure in the village, but in recent months, his presence had become associated with death, and the villagers had begun to regard him with the same superstitious dread they reserved for crows and will-o'-the-wisps. He found Hana Tanaka in the small house at the edge of the village, a dilapidated structure with a thatched roof that had begun to shed its straw in clumps, leaving bald patches that wept rainwater into the interior. She was outside, beating a futon against the wooden railing of the porch, her movements mechanical and absent, her face pale and pinched with the exhaustion of a young woman who had been thrust into the role of caretaker and bereaved daughter simultaneously. Hana was 20 years old, with the kind of plain, honest features that aged well but attracted little attention in youth. Her hair, which she wore in a simple bun at the nape of her neck, was already threaded with premature streaks of gray, and there were dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of sleep would erase. She looked up as Ren approached, and her expression shifted from resignation to a guarded hope. "Ren-san," she said, setting down the futon beater, "has Father Kaido completed the preparations? I had hoped to visit the temple today to say my final farewells." Ren opened his mouth to speak, to deliver Father Kaido's message about the desecration, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at Hana, at the fragile hope in her eyes, and he could not bring himself to shatter it with the reality of what waited in the courtyard. "Father Kaido asks that you come to the temple," he said instead, choosing his words with care. There is something you must see, something concerning your father's remains." Hana's face paled further, the last vestiges of color draining from her cheeks. "My father? What about my father? Ren-san, what has happened?" But Ren could only shake his head and gesture toward the path. "Come, I will walk with you, and we must find Shimada-san as well. Father Kaido has asked for him." Hana stared at him for a long moment, her hands clutching at the fabric of her worn apron, and then she nodded once sharply and went inside to fetch her jacket. When she emerged, She had composed her face into a mask of stoic acceptance, but Ren could see the tremor in her hands and the tightness around her mouth that betrayed her fear. Together, they walked back up the mountain path toward the temple, the morning sun climbing higher behind them, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the village like grasping fingers. Shimada Garo, the village elder, was a man of 70 years who had survived 2 famines, a landslide, and the slow death of his wife to consumption. He was not easily frightened, and he had seen enough of the world's cruelty to regard most human behavior with a cynical detachment. But when he entered the courtyard of Kurohadadera that morning, flanked by 4 younger men armed with firewood axes and farming scythes, he felt something cold and ancient stir in his chest, a premonition of doom that made his knees weak and his vision swim. He stood at the entrance to the courtyard for a long time, his hand gripping the wooden frame of the gate until his knuckles turned white, and he stared at the thing that had been Matsui Yujiro with an expression that wavered between revulsion and a terrible, fascinated horror. The others, strong men, farmers and woodcutters who had slaughtered pigs and butchered deer without a second thought, turned away and vomited into the dirt, their breakfast of rice and pickled vegetables splattering against the stones. One man, younger than the others, began to weep uncontrollably, his sobs echoing off the courtyard walls with a sound that was almost inhuman. Shimada forced himself to truly look at the desecration before him. The precision of it, the methodical nature of the butchery, suggested not madness but intention, not animal ferocity but a calculated, deliberate act. The body had been not merely destroyed but transformed, turned into a kind of grotesque art installation that spoke of an aesthetic sensibility as alien and incomprehensible as the geometry of a spider's web. "Cover it," Shimada said finally, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "Cover it and get it into the ground, deep, deeper than we've ever dug before. And then seal the chamber." He turned to Father Kaido, who stood nearby, his face a mask of grief and guilt. "What did this, Father? What could have done this?" Father Kaido shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the remains. "I do not know, Shimada-san, but I fear it is not finished. The hunger that did this. It is not sated. I can feel it, like a pressure in the air, like the silence before a thunderclap." Shimada wanted to dismiss the old monk's words as the superstition of a man who had spent too many years in the company of the dead, but he found that he could not. The courtyard felt wrong, suffused with a cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move with a subtle, organic rhythm that made his skin crawl. "Post guards," he ordered the men who had recovered enough to stand. 2 at the temple gate, 2 in the courtyard itself. Rotate every 4 hours. And if any of you see anything at all, that makes your hair stand on end, you scream. You scream until your throat bleeds." The men nodded, though their faces showed little confidence in the effectiveness of axes and scythes against whatever had peeled a man like a piece of fruit. They fetched a length of old sailcloth from the storage shed, and working with trembling hands and averted eyes, draped it over the remains of Matsui Yujiro. The cloth settled with a dry rustle, and for a moment the courtyard seemed to breathe, a subtle exhalation of air that stirred the chalky residue into small, swirling eddies. Shimada watched the dust dance and felt his blood run cold. He had lived long enough to know that some forces in the world operated according to rules that human reason could not fathom, and he suspected, with the deep intuition of an old man who had survived by trusting his instincts, that they were all in terrible danger. Hana arrived with Ren as the men were lifting the wrapped body onto a makeshift stretcher. She had heard the retching from the path and had run the last 100 yards, her face flushed and her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stopped at the courtyard entrance, her eyes finding the shape beneath the sailcloth, and she knew, with a mother's instinct, with a daughter's intuition, that something unspeakable had been done to her father's remains. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What has been done?" Ren placed a gentle hand on her arm, trying to guide her away, but she shook him off and stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the wrapped form. "Hana-san, please," Ren said. "Do not look. It will bring you only pain." But Hana was not listening. She reached the stretcher and, before anyone could stop her, pulled back the edge of the sailcloth. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life, would visit her in dreams that woke her screaming in the darkest hours of the night. She did not scream then, however. She made no sound at all. She simply stared, her eyes wide and unblinking, her face draining of all color until she looked like a corpse herself. Then, slowly, she released the cloth and turned away, her movements stiff and mechanical, like a puppet with its strings cut. She walked to the courtyard wall and leaned against it, her forehead pressed against the cold stone, and she began to shake. Not sob, not weep, but shake. A violent, uncontrollable trembling that racked her entire body and made her teeth chatter with a sound like dice in a cup. Ren went to her, placed his hands on her shoulders, and felt the vibration of her terror through his palms. "Hana-san," he whispered. "Hana-san, I am so sorry. I am so sorry." But Hana did not respond. She stood there, shaking, for a very long time, while the men carried the remains of her father away to be buried in a deep, unmarked grave in the temple's lower cemetery, and the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, indifferent to the suffering of the small creatures below. The days that followed were days of dread, each one stretching into an eternity of waiting. The villagers of Kurohata moved through their routines like sleepwalkers, their eyes darting to the shadows, their ears straining for sounds that should not exist. The guards at the temple reported nothing out of the ordinary, but they slept poorly when they slept at all, and 2 of them developed fevers that were not part of the wasting sickness, fevers born of exhaustion and fear. The body of Matsui Yujiro was buried in a grave dug to a depth of 10 feet, the earth packed down and weighted with stones. But Father Kaito could not shake the feeling that the earth itself was not enough, that the thing that had taken the old man would not be deterred by mere dirt and stone. He spent his days in the temple archives, a damp, moldy room in the oldest wing of the complex, poring over scrolls and texts that had not been read in centuries, searching for some mention, some hint, of what they were facing. The archives were a treasure trove of religious history, containing documents that dated back to the temple's founding in the 13th century. There were sutras copied by hand in elegant calligraphy, theological treatises on the nature of enlightenment, and tucked away in a corner behind a rotting cabinet, scrolls that spoke of darker things. Father Kaito had avoided these scrolls throughout his long career, respecting the tradition that some knowledge was too dangerous to be freely disseminated. But now, with the chalky residue still staining the courtyard stones no matter how many times they were scrubbed, with the memory of that peeled corpse haunting his every waking moment, he felt compelled to seek answers in the forbidden texts. The scrolls were written in a dialect of classical Japanese that was difficult to decipher, full of archaic characters and esoteric terminology, but Father Kaito was a scholar of some renown, and he worked through them with methodical patience. What he found chilled him more deeply than the sight of Matsui Yujiro's remains. The scrolls spoke of the Jikininki, the human-eating ghosts, spirits of priests who had succumbed to greed and corruption during their mortal lives, and who, after death, were cursed with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. But these were not the Jikininki of folklore, the simple grave-robbing ghouls that frightened children around campfires. These were something far worse. The text described them as beings trapped between life and death, existing in a state of perpetual agony that could only be momentarily alleviated by the consumption of the dead. They did not eat out of malice, the scroll explained, but out of desperate necessity, their souls screaming with a hunger that no amount of flesh could satisfy. And they were bound to the places where they had died, tethered to the earth by the weight of their sins, unable to wander far from the sites of their corruption. Father Kaito read the description of their appearance, human from a distance, but revealing their true nature upon closer inspection. their jaws unhinging to reveal rows of needle-like teeth, their fingers ending in curved claws designed for peeling flesh from bone, and he felt his stomach turn with a sick certainty. The Jikininki were real. They were here, and they were hungry. The scroll went on to describe the signs of their presence, the chalky residue left behind after feeding, the way the air smelled of old copper and wet earth, the manifestation of invisible structures in the twilight hours, ghostly extensions of their prison that existed only in the spaces between day and night. Father Kaito remembered the way the courtyard had seemed to breathe that morning, the way the shadows had moved with a life of their own, and he knew, with a terrible clarity, that the temple itself was the prison, and the Jikininki were its inmates. He read further, his hands trembling, and discovered that the curse was not limited to the dead. The scroll spoke of a contagion, a spiritual corruption that could pass to the living through the consumption of tainted flesh, a slow transformation that began with subtle changes, the sharpening of teeth, the intensification of smell, a growing discomfort in sunlight, and ended with the complete metamorphosis into a creature of eternal hunger. Father Kaito thought of Hana, of the way she had stood shaking in the courtyard, and of the body of her father that had been desecrated before her eyes, and he felt a new wave of fear wash over him. The Jikininki were not just a threat to the dead, they were a threat to the living, a plague that could consume the entire village if left unchecked. He rolled the scrolls carefully, his mind racing, and made his way to the main hall to find Ren. He needed to warn them all before it was too late. But Father Kaito never reached the main hall. As he emerged from the archives into the narrow corridor that connected the old wing to the newer sections of the temple, the light began to change. It was not yet twilight. The sun still hung high in the afternoon sky, but the corridor grew dark, the shadows lengthening and deepening with impossible speed, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. But there were no clouds that day. The sky was a flawless blue, visible through the gaps in the rotting roof. Father Kaito stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs, and he felt the temperature drop, the air growing cold enough to make his breath visible in small, white puffs. The smell hit him then, the smell of old copper and wet earth that the scroll had described, a metallic tang that coated his tongue and made his eyes water. He turned slowly, his body moving with the stiff reluctance of a man in a nightmare, and he saw that the corridor behind him had changed. Where there should have been the familiar passage to the archives, with its peeling plaster and sagging beams, there was now an extension, a wing of the temple that he had never seen before. The walls were made of dark, polished wood that seemed to absorb the dim light, and the floor was covered with tatami mats that were impossibly clean, impossibly white, as if no foot had ever trod upon them. Paper lanterns hung from the ceiling, their light a sickly yellow that cast more shadows than it dispelled, and at the end of the corridor, where there should have been a solid wall, there was a doorway. Father Kaito knew, with the absolute certainty of a man facing his own death, that he should not enter that doorway. He knew that whatever lay beyond it was not meant for living eyes, that the corridor was a manifestation of the Jikininki's prison, a ghostly extension of their realm that had overlapped with the world of the living. But his feet moved forward of their own accord, drawn by a morbid curiosity that overrode his terror, and he found himself walking down the corridor, his sandals making no sound on the white tatami, his breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. The doorway grew larger as he approached, and he could see that it opened onto a chamber, a room that was at once familiar and horribly alien. It was the main hall of the temple, but not as it existed in the present day. This was the main hall as it had been centuries ago, when Kurohatadera was a thriving religious center, before decay and neglect had reduced it to its current state of ruin. The gilded Buddha statue shone with a light that seemed to come from within, its expression serene and compassionate, but there was something wrong with the serenity, something that Father Kaito could not quite name. The statue's eyes, he realized, were not looking down at the worshippers in benevolent meditation. They were looking up, toward the ceiling, towards something that Father Kaido could not see but that he sensed with every fiber of his being. And then he heard the sound. It was a wet, tearing sound, like fabric being ripped, but slower, more deliberate, accompanied by a rhythmic, grunting exhalation that reminded Father Kaido of a pig at a trough. The smell of copper intensified, and with it came another smell, the smell of opened bowels and spilled intestines, the smell of a butcher shop on a hot day. Father Kaido reached the doorway and looked into the chamber, and what he saw broke something inside him, snapped the final thread of his sanity that had been fraying since the discovery of Matsui Yujiro's remains. There were figures in the chamber, half a dozen of them, crouched over the altar like worshippers at prayer. But they were not praying. They were feeding. The altar was covered with a body, or what remained of a body, and the figures were bent over it with an intensity that spoke of starvation, of desperation, of a hunger that had consumed their souls and left nothing but the animal need to eat. Their movements were methodical, precise, almost surgical, as they peeled away layers of flesh and muscle, separating the components with a skill that suggested long practice. And they were weeping. That was the most terrible thing, the detail that would haunt Father Kaido's final moments. They were not snarling or growling like beasts. They were sobbing, their shoulders shaking with grief, tears streaming down their faces even as they stuffed handfuls of flesh into their mouths. The sound of their weeping mixed with the wet tearing of flesh and the crunch of bone, creating a symphony of horror that was almost beautiful in its absolute awfulness. Father Kaido wanted to run, to turn and flee down the corridor and out into the sunlight, but his legs would not obey him. He stood frozen in the doorway, his hand pressed against the wooden frame, and he watched as one of the figures turned its head toward him. It was a man, or had been a man once, with features that might have been handsome in life, but were now distorted by the curse that had transformed him. His jaw hung loose, unhinged like that of a snake, and from its depths protruded rows of needle-like teeth, each one tapering to a wicked point. His eyes, which should have been dead and empty, were alive with a terrible intelligence, a consciousness that was aware of its own degradation and helpless to stop it. The creature looked at Father Kaido, and in its eyes the old monk saw an infinite well of suffering, a soul trapped in an eternity of hunger and grief. "Help us," the creature whispered, its voice a wet, gurgling rasp that seemed to come from deep in its throat. "Please, help us." And then it turned back to its meal, weeping harder now, its sobs rising into a wail that seemed to shake the very foundations of the temple. Father Kaido felt his knees buckle, felt himself sliding down the doorframe, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of darkness. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness claimed him was the creature's hand, reaching toward the altar, its fingers ending in curved claws that caught the sickly lantern light and gleamed like polished ivory. And then there was nothing but the sound of weeping and the smell of copper and the cold, endless dark. Ren found Father Kaido unconscious in the corridor of the old wing, slumped against the doorframe with his head lolled to one side and his breathing so shallow that, for one terrible moment, Ren thought the old monk was dead. It was nearly dusk, the light failing rapidly as the sun dipped behind the western peaks, and Ren had been searching for Father Kaido for over an hour, growing increasingly anxious as the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped. He had checked the main hall, the kitchen, the sleeping quarters, and finally, driven by a premonition he could not explain, he had ventured into the oldest section of the temple, the part that even the monks avoided after dark. The corridor had seemed normal when he entered it, but as he progressed deeper into the wing, he had begun to notice things that made his skin prickle with unease. The way the air grew colder with each step, the faint smell of copper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, the shadows that pooled in the corners with a density that suggested substance rather than mere absence of light. He had found Father Kaido at the end of the corridor, near the entrance to the archives, and the sight of the old monk's ashen face and vacant eyes had sent a jolt of panic through Ren's chest that made him cry out and rush forward, dropping to his knees beside the fallen priest. "Father Kaido, Father, can you hear me?" Ren cradled the old man's head in his lap, feeling the coldness of the skin against his palms, and he shook the monk gently, then more urgently, until Father Kaido's eyelids fluttered open. The eyes that looked up at Ren were different from the eyes Ren had known for 4 years. They were wider, more luminous, as if they had seen something that had burned away the protective layers of skepticism and resignation that age and experience had built up. "Ren," Father Kaido whispered, his voice barely audible. "The scrolls, the archives. You must not go in there, not after sunset, not ever." "Father, what happened? What did you see?" Ren helped the old monk to sit up, supporting him with an arm around his shoulders, and he felt the trembling that ran through Father Kaido's frame like a current. "I saw them, Ren, the Jikininki, they are here. They have always been here beneath the stones in the spaces between the walls, waiting for the dead to multiply. And now they are growing bold, the hunger. It is changing them, making them desperate." Father Kaido's hand closed around Ren's wrist with surprising strength, and he pulled the young monk close, his breath hot against Ren's ear. "They wept, Ren, they wept as they fed. That is the worst part. They are not evil, not in the way we understand evil. They are suffering, and suffering, when it becomes unbearable, seeks to spread itself." Ren felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold corridor run down his spine. He helped Father Kaido to his feet and supported him as they made their way back to the main hall, the old monk leaning heavily on the younger man's arm, his steps uncertain and his breathing labored. They passed through the courtyard, where the chalky residue had been scrubbed away, but a faint, ghostly pallor still lingered on the stones, and Ren thought he saw movement in the corner of his vision, a fluttering shadow that disappeared when he turned his head to look. He told himself it was his imagination, the product of fear and suggestion, but he walked faster nonetheless, nearly dragging Father Kaido through the gate and into the relative safety of the newer sections of the temple. They settled Father Kaido in his sleeping quarters, a small room off the main hall with a thin futon and a brazier that Ren filled with coals from the kitchen. The old monk refused to eat, waving away the bowl of rice and miso soup that Ren brought, and he would not speak further of what he had seen, simply staring at the ceiling with those wide, haunted eyes until Ren, unable to bear the silence, retreated to his own cell. He lay on his futon for hours, staring into the darkness, listening to the sounds of the temple settling around him. The creak of old wood, the scurry of rats in the walls, the distant hoot of an owl in the forest beyond. But beneath these familiar sounds, he began to detect something else, a subtle undertone that was not quite audible but was felt in the bones, a vibration like the lowest string of a bass instrument plucked in a distant room. It was the sound, he realized with a sinking heart, of hunger. Not his own hunger, but something else's, something vast and ancient and utterly without mercy. He pulled his thin blanket up to his chin and squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sensation, but it persisted, a pressure behind his eyes and in his teeth, a feeling that he was being watched by eyes that did not need light to see. Sometime after midnight, he must have drifted into a fitful sleep, because he woke to a scream. It was not a human scream, or at least not entirely human. It was high and thin, like the cry of a rabbit in a trap, but it was underlaid with a deeper, guttural sound, a growling moan that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. Ren sat bolt upright in his futon, his heart hammering against his ribs, and he strained his ears, listening for the sound to repeat. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the snapping of the brazier's coals and his own ragged breathing. He told himself it had been a dream, a nightmare born of the day's horrors, but he could not make himself believe it. He rose from his futon, dressed quickly in his robes, and stepped out into the corridor. The temple was dark, the few oil lamps having burned down to guttering pools of liquid that cast more shadows than light. He moved cautiously, his hand trailing along the wall for guidance, and made his way toward the main hall. As he passed Father Kaido's room, he paused, listening for the old monk's breathing, but the room was silent. He pushed the door open a crack and peered inside. The futon was empty. Father Kaido was gone. Ren felt a surge of panic that made his vision swim. He called out the old monk's name, his voice sounding small and frightened in the vast emptiness of the temple, and received no answer. He moved faster now, almost running, his sandals slapping against the wooden floors with a sound that seemed obscenely loud in the silence. He checked the kitchen, the storage rooms, the latrine, but Father Kaido was nowhere to be found. And then, as he was passing the corridor that led to the old wing, he smelled it again. The copper smell, the smell of wet earth, the smell that Father Kaido had described. It was stronger now, thick enough to taste, and it seemed to be coming from the courtyard. Ren hesitated at the entrance to the corridor, his hand on the wall, his body frozen between the impulse to flee and the impulse to investigate. He thought of Father Kaido's warning, of the scrolls in the archives that spoke of things that should not be named, and he knew, with a clarity that surprised him, that if he went into the courtyard now, in the darkest hour of the night, he would see something that would change him forever. But he also knew that Father Kaido was out there somewhere, alone and vulnerable, and that the old man had saved his life once years ago, when Ren had first arrived at the temple, a frightened boy of 15 who had nearly drowned in the mountain river during a spring flood. He owed Father Kaido his life, and he could not abandon him now, not even to save himself. He took a deep breath, tasting copper, and stepped into the corridor. The cold hit him like a physical blow, a wave of freezing air that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to conserve warmth, and walked forward, his steps slow and deliberate, his ears straining for any sound that might betray the presence of something unnatural. The corridor seemed longer than he remembered, the walls stretching away into a darkness that was absolute, unbroken by any source of light. He walked for what felt like minutes, then hours, the cold intensifying with each step, until he began to wonder if the corridor had become infinite, a labyrinth of stone and shadow from which there was no escape. And then he saw the light. It was faint, a sickly yellow glow that flickered and danced like candlelight seen through water, and it was coming from the direction of the courtyard. Ren's heart leaped in his chest, a mixture of relief and terror, and he moved toward it, his pace quickening, his breath coming in short, white puffs. The corridor opened into the courtyard, and Ren stepped through the archway and stopped, his mouth falling open in a silent scream. The courtyard had changed. Where there should have been the familiar ruins, the crumbling walls, the overgrown garden, the cracked flagstones, there was now a vast, impossible structure that stretched into the sky like the ribcage of some gigantic beast. It was the temple, but not the temple as it existed in the waking world. This was the temple as it had been in its prime, multiplied and extended, twisted into geometries that hurt the eye and made the stomach turn. Towers rose at impossible angles, their spires piercing clouds that were not there. Corridors branched and rejoined in patterns that suggested a mind bent on madness. And everywhere, in every window and doorway and balcony, there were figures. They were human-shaped, or nearly so, but their proportions were wrong, their limbs too long, their heads too large, their movements jerky and unnatural. They stood in the windows, looking down at Ren with eyes that glowed with a pale, phosphorescent light, and they made sounds. Small, whimpering sounds like children in pain, like animals in traps. Ren felt his knees weaken, felt the strength drain from his legs, but he forced himself to stand, to look around, to search for Father Kaido in this nightmare landscape. And then he saw him. The old monk was standing near the center of the courtyard, or what had been the courtyard, surrounded by a group of the creatures. They were not touching him, not yet, but they were close, close enough for Ren to see the details of their faces. The slack, unhinged jaws, the rows of needle teeth, the tears streaming down their cheeks as they wept with a grief that seemed to have no end. Father Kaido was looking at them with an expression that Ren could not read, not fear exactly, and not resignation, but something between the two, a kind of terrible compassion that seemed to transcend the horror of the situation. "Father," Ren shouted, and his voice echoed through the impossible space, bouncing off walls that should not exist and returning to him distorted and multiplied. "Father, run!" But Father Kaido did not run. He turned his head slowly toward Ren, and he smiled, a sad, gentle smile that was more terrible than any snarl could have been. "There is no running from this, Ren," he said, his voice carrying with an unnatural clarity across the distance between them. "There is only acceptance, and perhaps, if we are fortunate, a moment of peace." The creatures around him stirred, their whimpers rising in pitch, their bodies trembling with a hunger that was almost palpable. One of them, a figure that might once have been a woman, reached out a clawed hand and touched Father Kaido's cheek with a tenderness that was obscene in its gentleness. The old monk closed his eyes, and a single tear traced a path down his weathered face. "No!" Ren screamed, and he ran forward, his feet pounding against the flagstones, his arms outstretched as if he could reach the old monk across the impossible distance. But the courtyard seemed to stretch before him, the distance between himself and Father Kaido growing with each step, and the creatures turned their glowing eyes toward him, their whimpers changing to a sound that was almost eager, almost hopeful. Ren ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed with the effort, and still Father Kaido remained just out of reach, a small figure in black robes surrounded by the weeping monsters. And then, just as Ren felt that his heart would burst from the exertion, the scene before him began to fade, the impossible temple dissolving like mist in the morning sun, the creatures melting into shadows that flowed away into the cracks between the stones. Father Kaido was the last to disappear, his image lingering for a moment like a photograph held too long in the light, his smile still fixed upon his face, his eyes looking directly into Ren's with a message that Ren could not decipher. And then he was gone, and Ren was standing alone in the real courtyard, the ruined courtyard, the familiar courtyard, with the moon overhead and the cold mountain air filling his lungs. He fell to his knees, gasping, his body shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and terror, and he looked around at the empty stones, the crumbling walls, the overgrown garden, and he knew with a certainty that went beyond reason that what he had seen was real, that Father Kaido was gone, and that he would never see the old monk again. He stayed in the courtyard until dawn, unable to move, unable to think, his mind a blank sheet upon which the horrors of the night were slowly being inscribed in letters of fire. When the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern peaks, he rose, stiff and aching, and made his way back to the main hall. He did not tell anyone what he had seen. He could not. The words would not come, and even if they had, he doubted that anyone would believe him. Instead, he went about his duties with a mechanical precision that masked his inner turmoil, performing the morning prayers, lighting the incense, preparing the simple breakfast of rice and tea that the monks shared. When the other monks, there were only 3 besides himself and Father Kaido, all of them old men who had lived at the temple for decades, asked after Father Kaido, Ren told them that the old monk had gone to meditate in the mountain caves and would return in a few days. It was a lie, and Ren was not a good liar, but the other monks were too tired, too absorbed in their own grief and fear, to question him closely. They nodded and returned to their tasks, and Ren was left alone with his secret. But he was not truly alone. As the day progressed, he began to feel a presence, a weight upon his consciousness that was not his own. It was subtle at first, a faint tickle at the back of his mind, a whisper of sound that might have been the wind or might have been something else. But as the sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened, the presence grew stronger, more insistent. It was hunger, he realized. The same hunger he had felt the night before, but now it was directed at him, focused upon him like a lens focusing sunlight. The Jikininki knew him now. They had seen him in their realm, and they were waiting for him to return. He spent the day in a state of barely controlled panic, jumping at shadows, starting at sounds, his hands trembling so badly that he spilled tea and dropped rice bowls. The other monks looked at him with concern, but he waved away their questions, blaming his behavior on lack of sleep and worry over the village's plight. He knew he needed help, needed someone to confide in, someone who might understand or at least believe him. and there was only one person he could think of who might fit that description. Hana. She had seen the desecrated body. She had looked into the face of the horror and had not looked away. If anyone would understand, it would be her. He waited until evening, until the other monks had retired to their cells and the temple was quiet, and then he slipped out of the gate and made his way down the mountain path to the village. The walk seemed longer than usual, the darkness between the trees more absolute, the sounds of the forest more threatening. He kept his eyes fixed on the path, his ears straining for any sound that might indicate pursuit, but he heard nothing except the normal night sounds of the mountains. When he reached the village, he found it changed, subtly but unmistakably. The houses that had been dark and shuttered were now lit from within, their windows glowing with a warm, yellow light that seemed to Ren like the last beacon of a sinking ship. But the light was wrong, somehow, too steady, too uniform, as if it were not coming from lamps or candles but from some other source. The streets were empty, the villagers having retreated indoors as the sun set, and Ren walked through the silence with a feeling of profound isolation, as if he were the last living thing in a world of ghosts. He found Hana's house easily enough, the dilapidated structure sitting at the edge of the village like a forgotten toy. But as he approached, he saw that the door was open, swinging gently on its hinges, and the light inside was not the warm yellow of oil lamps but the sickly phosphorescence he had seen in the impossible temple. His heart sank, and he ran the last few yards, calling Hana's name, his voice cracking with fear. He found her inside, sitting on the floor of the main room, her knees drawn up to her chin, her arms wrapped around her legs, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was staring at something that Ren could not see, something in the corner of the room where the shadows pooled thickest, and she was rocking back and forth, making a small, repetitive sound that was not quite a hum and not quite a moan. "Hana-san," Ren said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Hana-san, it is Ren, from the temple." She turned her head slowly toward him, and her eyes, which had been focused on something in the distance, gradually came back to the present. She looked at him for a long moment as if she did not recognize him, and then her face crumpled and she began to cry great wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Ren went to her, knelt beside her, and placed a tentative hand on her shoulder. She leaned into him, her head falling against his chest, and she clutched at his robes with a desperation that spoke of a soul on the verge of breaking. "I saw them," she whispered between sobs. "I saw them in the twilight. They were in the trees, in the spaces between the branches. They were watching me. They were weeping." Ren felt a chill run through him. "You saw them too?" he asked. "The Jikininki." Hana pulled back from him, her eyes red and swollen but suddenly sharp with understanding. "You know what they are. You know their name." Ren nodded, and he told her everything. He told her about Father Kaido's discovery of the scrolls, about the old monk's disappearance, about his own experience in the courtyard, about the impossible temple that manifested in the twilight hours. He told her about the creature's hunger, their grief, their endless, desperate weeping. And he told her about the contagion, the corruption that could pass to the living through the consumption of tainted flesh. As he spoke, Hana's expression changed from fear to a kind of horrified fascination, and when he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. "My father," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "They desecrated his body, they consumed him, and I was there. I touched the cloth that covered him, I breathed the air where they had been." She looked up at Ren, and her eyes were filled with a terror that was beyond words. Am I becoming one of them?" Ren did not know how to answer. The scrolls had spoken of the contagion, but they had not described the timeline, the symptoms, the progression of the corruption. He took her hands in his, feeling their coldness, their trembling, and he squeezed them gently. "I do not know," he said honestly, "but we will find out together, and we will find a way to stop this. We must, for the village, for everyone." Hana nodded, though the fear did not leave her eyes, and together they sat in the dim light of her house, waiting for the dawn, listening to the sounds of the night and the whispers of the hunger that was slowly consuming their world. The next morning, they returned to the temple together. Hana walking with a determined stride that belied her inner terror, Ren supporting her with his presence if not his confidence. The other monks were surprised to see a woman in the temple grounds, but they were too tired and too frightened to object, and they retreated to their cells, leaving Ren and Hana alone in the main hall. Ren showed Hana the scrolls he had found in the archives, the forbidden texts that described the Jikininki in detail, and together they pored over the ancient script, trying to find some weakness, some way to defeat the creatures or at least to protect themselves from them. The scrolls were frustratingly vague on the subject of defense. They described the Jikininki's hunger, their grief, their eternal torment, but they offered little in the way of practical advice for those who encountered them. There was mention of ritual incense, a specific blend of herbs and resins that could mask the scent of the living and render them invisible to the creature's senses. There was mention of holy water, of prayers, of the power of faith to repel the unclean. But there was also the suggestion, buried deep in the text, that the Jikininki were not truly evil, that they were victims of a curse that had been placed upon them by an angry deity, and that the only true solution was not to destroy them but to release them, to break the curse, and allow their souls to pass on to the next life. But how? Hana asked, her finger tracing the faded characters on the scroll. How do we break a curse that has lasted for centuries? Ren shook his head, his eyes bleary from hours of reading in the dim light. I do not know, but there must be a way. The scrolls speak of a ritual, a funerary prayer performed on a mass scale that can ease the suffering of the dead and guide them to rebirth. Perhaps if we perform this ritual for the Jikininki themselves, if we treat them not as monsters but as lost souls, we can break the cycle. Hana looked at him with an expression that was equal parts hope and skepticism. You want to hold a funeral for creatures that eat the dead. You want to pray for things that peel the flesh from bones. Ren met her gaze steadily. They were priests once, Hana-san. Corrupt priests, yes, greedy and sinful, but priests nonetheless. They served the Buddha and they fell from grace. Does that mean they are beyond redemption? The Buddha teaches compassion for all beings, even the most wretched. If we deny them that compassion, are we not also falling from grace? Hana was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching Ren's face for some sign of deception or madness. But she found only sincerity and a courage that she had not expected from the quiet, serious young monk. Very well, she said at last, but we must be careful. The villagers are already terrified. If they learn that we are planning to hold a ceremony for the creatures that have been devouring their dead, they will turn on us. They will think we are mad, or worse, that we are in league with the monsters. We will tell them only what they need to know, Ren said. We will say that we are holding a mass funerary rite for all the dead of the village, a ceremony to ease their passage and protect the living from restless spirits. It is not entirely a lie. The dead do need our prayers, and the ritual may indeed protect the living. But we will also include the Jikininki in our prayers, whether the villagers know it or not. We will offer them the compassion they have been denied for centuries, and perhaps, just perhaps, they will find peace. Hana nodded slowly, though her face showed that she was far from convinced. And if it does not work, if the creatures reject our prayers and turn on us, Ren's expression grew grim, then we will do what we must to survive, and we will pray that the Buddha grants us the strength to face whatever comes. They spent the next 3 days preparing for the ceremony. Ren sent word to the village, announcing that a mass funerary rite would be held at the temple on the night of the full moon, and that all families who had lost loved ones in the past year were encouraged to bring their remains for a final blessing. The response was overwhelming. The villagers, desperate for some sign of hope, some gesture that might protect them from the darkness that had descended upon their lives, embraced the idea with a fervor that bordered on hysteria. Bodies were exhumed from shallow winter graves, removed from the mortuary chambers, carried up the mountain path on biers and in carts, and in the arms of weeping family members. By the night of the ceremony, there were over 60 bodies gathered in the temple courtyard and the surrounding grounds, a silent congregation of the dead that seemed to press against the boundaries of the living world, with an insistence that was almost palpable. The atmosphere in the village was electric with fear and anticipation. The villagers spoke in whispers, their eyes darting to the shadows, their hands clutching at talismans and prayer beads. They had heard the rumors, the stories of desecrated graves and missing bodies, and they knew, with a knowledge that went beyond reason, that something terrible was watching them from the darkness. But they also hoped, with a hope that was as desperate as their fear, that the ceremony would bring an end to their suffering, that the prayers of the monks would be heard by the powers that govern the universe, and that the dead would finally rest in peace. Ren and Hana worked tirelessly, preparing the ritual space, arranging the bodies in concentric circles around the central altar, anointing them with holy water and scattering them with rice and salt. They built a great pyre of cedar branches in the center of the courtyard, intended to be lit at the climax of the ceremony, sending the prayers of the living upward on columns of smoke. They placed bundles of the special incense, a blend of sandalwood, clove, and a rare mountain herb called ghost's breath, that was said to mask the scent of the living, at strategic points around the perimeter, creating a protective veil that would, they hoped, render the living invisible to the Jikininki while the ceremony was underway. As the sun began to set on the night of the full moon, the villagers began to arrive. They came in groups, huddled together for protection, their faces pale and their eyes wide. They filled the temple grounds, overflowing into the courtyard and the surrounding gardens, a sea of frightened humanity pressed against the darkness that was slowly enveloping the mountain. Ren stood at the entrance to the main hall, dressed in his finest ceremonial robes, and he watched them come with a mixture of pity and dread. He knew that many of these people would not survive the night. He knew that the Jikininki would come, drawn by the scent of so many dead gathered in one place, and that the ceremony might not be enough to protect the living. But he also knew that there was no turning back. The stage was set, the players assembled, and the final act of the tragedy was about to begin. The moon rose full and bloated over the temple of Kurohadadera, casting a silver light that seemed to amplify rather than dispel the shadows, making the ruins appear both more solid and more ghostly, as if they existed in two places at once. Ren stood upon the raised platform of the main altar, looking out over the sea of faces and the silent congregation of the dead, and he felt a premonition of doom settle upon his shoulders like a physical weight. The villagers had arranged themselves in tight clusters, families huddled together, their eyes fixed upon him with a mixture of desperate hope and animal fear. The bodies of their loved ones lay in concentric circles around the central pyre, wrapped in white shrouds that seemed to glow with an inner luminescence in the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of incense, the ghost's breath blend that Ren and Hana had prepared, and beneath that scent, faint but unmistakable, was the smell of copper and wet earth that signaled the approach of the Jikininki. Ren raised his hands, and the murmuring crowd fell silent, their breathing collectively held, their hearts collectively hammering. He began to chant, his voice high and clear in the stillness, the ancient words of the funerary prayer rolling out across the courtyard like waves upon a shore. The prayer was meant to guide the dead to the pure land, to ease their suffering and speed their rebirth. But as Ren chanted, he directed his thoughts not only to the 60 souls gathered before him, but to the creatures that lurked in the invisible spaces between the stones, the priests who had fallen from grace and been cursed with eternal hunger. He prayed for them too, silently, his mind reaching out into the darkness with a compassion that he hoped would be heard. Hana stood beside him, dressed in a simple white kimono that marked her as a mourner, and she held a bundle of incense sticks that she lit from the central brazier, distributing them to the villagers with hands that trembled only slightly. The people took the incense with reverence, holding it before them like swords against the darkness, and they joined their voices to Ren's, the chant rising in volume and intensity until it seemed to shake the very stones of the temple. The pyre in the center of the courtyard had been lit, and the flames licked upward, casting dancing shadows that played across the faces of the dead and the living, making them seem interchangeable, as if the boundary between life and death had grown thin as rice paper. And then the temperature dropped. It happened suddenly, not gradually, as if a door had been opened onto a frozen wasteland. The villagers gasped, their breath visible in white clouds, and the flames of the pyre guttered and shrank, struggling against a wind that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The chanting faltered, voices stumbling over syllables, and Ren felt his heart sink as he looked up and saw that the moon was being eaten by a shadow, a darkness that spread across its surface with terrifying speed. But it was not an eclipse. It was something else, something that blocked the light from within, a presence that absorbed illumination like a sponge absorbs water. The shadows in the corners of the courtyard deepened, thickened, and began to move with a purpose that was unmistakably alive. Ren saw it first, because he had been expecting it, because he had known in his bones that the Jikininki would come. A figure emerged from the darkness near the eastern wall, human-shaped but wrong, its proportions stretched and distorted, its movements jerky and tentative, like a marionette operated by an unskilled hand. It was followed by another, and another, until the walls of the courtyard seemed to be lined with them, a silent audience of the damned watching the ceremony with eyes that glowed with a pale, hungry light. The villagers saw them too, and the screaming started. It began as a single, high-pitched shriek from a woman near the back of the crowd, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that sliced through the chanting like a blade through silk. Then others took up the cry, and the courtyard became a cauldron of panic, bodies surging and churning, people pushing and trampling each other in their desperation to reach the gates, to escape the temple, to flee the monsters that were stepping out of the shadows with a slow, deliberate inevitability. But the gates were blocked, not by the Jikininki, but by the architecture itself, the invisible wing of the temple that had manifested in the twilight hours, extending the courtyard into a labyrinth of corridors and chambers that had no exit. The villagers who reached the gates found themselves running into walls that had not been there moments before, corridors that led back to where they had started, doorways that opened onto impossible spaces. They were trapped, corralled like livestock, and the Jikininki advanced upon them with a hunger that was terrible in its patience. Ren stood his ground upon the altar, his voice still chanting though his throat was raw and his lungs burned, and he watched as the creatures moved into the torchlight. From a distance they had looked almost human, but as they drew closer, the details became clear, and the horror was magnified 1,000-fold. Their jaws hung loose, unhinged like those of snakes, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that gleamed in the firelight with a wet, obscene luster. Their fingers ended in curved claws, ivory-white and razor-sharp, designed for the specific purpose of peeling flesh from bone. Their eyes, which should have been dead and empty, were alive with a terrible intelligence, a consciousness that was aware of its own degradation and helpless to stop it. And they were weeping. Great, shuddering sobs racked their bodies, tears streaming down their faces, mixing with the saliva that dripped from their gaping jaws. They did not snarl or growl. They did not roar with triumph. They wept, their cries of grief rising above the screams of the villagers in a counterpoint of agony that was more psychologically disturbing than any bestial rage could have been. The first attack happened with a speed that was shocking in its efficiency. A Jikininki, a figure that might once have been a tall, dignified man, reached the edge of the crowd and seized a young farmer who had been trying to shield his wife. The creature's claws closed around the farmer's arm, and with a movement that was almost gentle, almost loving, it pulled the man toward its gaping maw. The farmer screamed, a high, bubbling sound that was cut short as the teeth closed around his throat. But the Jikininki did not bite down immediately. It paused, its eyes rolling back in its head, its body shuddering with a spasm of what might have been ecstasy or might have been revulsion. Then it began to feed, and the sound of its feeding, the wet tearing of flesh, the crunch of cartilage, the slurping of blood and tissue, was drowned out only by its own sobbing, its own endless, hopeless weeping. The farmer's wife, paralyzed with horror, stood rooted to the spot, watching her husband being consumed by a creature that wept as it ate. And then the Jikininki turned to her, its jaw dripping with gore, and it reached for her with a hand that trembled with a hunger that could never be satisfied. The massacre spread outward from that first point of contact like a ripple in a pond, the Jikininki moving among the villagers with a terrible grace, selecting their victims with an almost aesthetic deliberation. They did not kill indiscriminately. They chose the recently dead first, descending upon the shrouded bodies with a desperation that suggested starvation, peeling away the shrouds and tearing into the chilled flesh with teeth and claws that worked in perfect coordination. But there were not enough dead to satisfy them, not nearly enough, and as the supply of corpses dwindled, they turned to the living. A mother clutching her infant was pulled down, the child torn from her arms and tossed aside, its skull cracking against a stone with a sound like a breaking egg. An elderly man who had been trying to reach the altar was intercepted by a Jikininki that had once been a woman, her clawed hands closing around his shoulders with a grip that crushed bone, and she lifted him to her maw with a strength that was impossible for her wasted frame. A group of young men who had armed themselves with farming implements attempted to fight back, swinging their hoes and scythes with desperate courage, but the Jikininki moved too fast, too fluidly, dodging the blows with an agility that was not of this world, and they retaliated with claws that opened bellies and throats with surgical precision. The courtyard became an abattoir, the stones running with blood that steamed in the freezing air, the screams of the dying rising in a cacophony that seemed to shake the mountain itself. Ren watched from the altar, his chanting faltering, his voice breaking, as the Jikininki fed with a desperate, sobbing urgency that was more terrible than any mere violence. They did not enjoy the killing. They grieved it, each act of consumption accompanied by a wail of sorrow that was almost human, almost recognizable as the expression of a soul in torment. One creature, a thing that might once have been a young monk not unlike Ren himself, paused in its feeding to look up at the altar, and Ren saw in its eyes a pleading, a desperate request for release, for an end to the hunger that was consuming it from within. "Please," the creature mouthed, blood dripping from its teeth. "Please make it stop." And then it turned back to its meal, its sobs rising in pitch until they became a scream, a howl of anguish that pierced Ren's heart like a blade. He wanted to help them, wanted to find the words or the gesture that would break the curse and release them from their torment, but the chaos around him was too overwhelming, the death too immediate, and he felt his compassion being drowned in a rising tide of terror. Hana grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh with a strength born of panic. "Ren," she screamed, her voice barely audible above the din. "We have to run, we have to hide." But there was nowhere to run. The courtyard had become a maze of impossible architecture, the invisible wing of the temple manifesting in full, its corridors and chambers blocking every avenue of escape. The Jikininki were everywhere, moving through the crowd with the efficiency of harvesters in a field of wheat, their claws flashing, their teeth closing, their bodies shaking with the grief of creatures who had lost their humanity long ago and could never get it back. Ren looked around desperately, searching for some shelter, some sanctuary, and his eyes fell upon the inner sanctum, the small chamber behind the main altar that housed the temple's most sacred relics. The door was wooden, reinforced with iron bands, and it was the only structure in the courtyard that seemed unaffected by the spatial distortion, the only place that remained solid and real in a world that was dissolving into nightmare. "The sanctum," he shouted to Hana, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the door. "Hurry!" They ran, stumbling over bodies and slipping in blood, their robes heavy with the mist of vaporized gore that hung in the freezing air. Behind them, the Jikininki continued their feast, the sounds of tearing flesh and crunching bone mixing with the endless, hopeless weeping to create a symphony of horror that would haunt Ren's dreams for the rest of his life. They reached the sanctum door and Ren threw his shoulder against it, the old wood groaning but holding firm. He fumbled for the key that hung on a cord around his neck, the key that Father Kaito had entrusted to him years ago, and he jammed it into the lock with trembling fingers. The lock clicked, the door swung inward, and they tumbled into the small, dark chamber, slamming the door behind them and throwing the heavy iron bolt just as something slammed into the other side, with a force that made the wood shudder in its frame. Ren and Hana pressed themselves against the door, their bodies shaking, their breath coming in ragged gasps, and they listened as the massacre continued outside. The sanctum was a small room, perhaps 10 feet square, with no windows and only the one door. The walls were lined with shelves that held the temple's sacred objects, ancient statuettes of the Buddha, fragments of sutras written on palm leaves, vials of holy water, and bundles of the ritual incense that Ren had hoped would protect them. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal upon which rested the temple's greatest treasure, a golden reliquary said to contain a fragment of the Buddha's own bone. The air in the sanctum was thick with the scent of old incense and dust, and it was warm, protected from the supernatural cold that had descended upon the courtyard. Ren slid down the door until he was sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the wood, his legs too weak to support him. Hana sat beside him, her knees drawn up to her chin, her arms wrapped around her legs, her face a mask of shock that was only now beginning to crack, allowing the grief and terror beneath to seep through. "My father," she whispered. "They are eating my father. They are eating all of them." Ren wanted to comfort her, to tell her that the dead could not feel pain, that their suffering had ended with their last breath, but he knew that was not true. The scrolls had spoken of the Jikininki's curse, of the way they trapped the souls of those they consumed, binding them to the same torment that afflicted the creatures themselves. The dead of Kurohata would not find peace in the Pure Land. They would join the Jikininki in their eternal hunger, their souls devoured and incorporated into the same cycle of suffering that had consumed the corrupt priests. "We have to stop them," Ren said, his voice rough and broken. "We have to find a way to end this, or the entire village will be consumed, body and soul." Hana turned to him, her eyes red and swollen but suddenly fierce with a determination that surprised him. How the scrolls spoke of a ritual of a mass funerary prayer. "We performed the prayer, we chanted the sutras, we offered them compassion and they rejected it, they came anyway, they fed anyway." Ren shook his head, his mind racing. "No, not rejected. They could not hear it or they could not accept it. The curse is too strong, the hunger too deep. We offered them compassion, but compassion alone is not enough. We need something more. Something that can break the physical bond that ties them to this place." He looked around the sanctum, his eyes falling upon the bundles of ritual incense, the ghost's breath blend that masked the scent of the living. An idea began to form in his mind, fragile and desperate, but the only one he had. "The incense," he said, reaching for a bundle and crushing the dried herbs between his fingers, releasing a pungent aroma that made his eyes water. "It masks our scent. It makes us invisible to them. But what if we used it differently? What if we used it to amplify our scent instead, to make ourselves so overwhelmingly present that they could not ignore us?" Hana stared at him. "You want to make us more visible to them? Ren, are you mad? They are killing everyone out there. Why would you want to draw their attention?" "Not our scent," Ren corrected, his voice gaining strength as the idea took shape. "The scent of the dead. The incense masks the living, but it also enhances the presence of the dead. If we burn enough of it, concentrated in one place, it might create a beacon that draws all the Jikininki to a single point. And if that point is beneath the most unstable section of the ruins..." Hana's eyes widened as she understood. "You want to collapse the temple. You want to bury them. The scrolls said they were bound to the ruins, tethered to the stones. If we bury them beneath tons of rock, they might be trapped, sealed away where they can no longer reach the living. And the villagers, the survivors..." Ren's face hardened. "We give them as much warning as we can. We create a diversion, draw the Jikininki to the center, and then trigger the collapse. Those who can run, run. Those who cannot..." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Hana looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she nodded once sharply. "Show me what to do." They worked quickly, their hands shaking but their movements precise. They gathered all the incense in the sanctum, dozens of bundles, and soaked them in the holy water that was stored in ceramic jars on the shelves. The wet incense would burn slower, releasing its smoke in thick, concentrated clouds that would carry the scent of the dead for miles. They tied the bundles together with lengths of prayer cord, creating a massive, sodden mass that would serve as their beacon. Then they turned their attention to the structure of the temple itself. Ren knew the ruins better than anyone, having spent 4 years exploring every corner, every tunnel, every hidden chamber. He knew where the walls were weakest, where the foundations had been undermined by centuries of rain and frost, where a single strategically placed blow could bring down an entire section. The key, he realized, was the eastern wall of the courtyard, the section that abutted the oldest part of the temple, the wing that dated back to the Kamakura period. The wall was supported by a single massive lintel stone that had been cracked by an earthquake decades ago, a crack that had been patched with mortar but never truly repaired. If they could dislodge that stone, the entire eastern wall would collapse, bringing down the overhanging roof and the tower above it, burying the courtyard beneath tons of rock and timber. But to reach the lintel stone, they would have to leave the sanctum, to step out into the courtyard where the Jikininki were feeding, to walk among the monsters with nothing but the scent of incense to protect them. "I will go," Ren said, tying the bundle of wet incense to his back with strips of cloth. "You stay here. If I do not return in 10 minutes, bar the door and do not open it for anyone, not even me." Hana grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "No, I am coming with you. I have lost everything, my father, my home, my future. I will not cower in a hole while you risk your life alone. We started this together. We finish it together." Ren looked into her eyes and saw the same determination that he felt in his own heart, the refusal to surrender to despair, the stubborn will to fight even when fighting seemed hopeless. He nodded, and together they unbarred the door and stepped out into the courtyard of hell. The scene that greeted them was beyond anything that Ren had imagined in his darkest nightmares. The courtyard was unrecognizable, transformed into a landscape of horror that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The bodies of the villagers lay everywhere, some still twitching, most already still, their forms mutilated beyond recognition. The stones were slick with blood that reflected the moonlight in a way that made them seem to glow with an inner fire. The Jikininki moved among the dead and dying with a terrible grace, their weeping now mixed with a sound that was almost like singing, a high, keening wail that rose and fell in a rhythm that suggested some terrible, alien music. The creatures paid no attention to Ren and Hana as they emerged from the sanctum, their senses overwhelmed by the abundance of prey, their minds focused entirely on the feeding. The two humans moved cautiously, stepping over bodies and around pools of blood, their sandals making wet sucking sounds that were fortunately drowned out by the cacophony of feeding and weeping. Ren led the way toward the eastern wall, his eyes fixed on the massive lintel stone that loomed above them like the sword of Damocles. It was closer than he had remembered, or perhaps the spatial distortion of the invisible wing had compressed the distances, and they reached it in what felt like moments, though it might have been hours. Ren unslung the bundle of incense and placed it at the base of the wall, directly beneath the cracked lintel. He fumbled for the flint and steel that he carried in his sleeve, his hands shaking so badly that he nearly dropped them, and struck a spark that caught on the dry edges of the wet bundles. The incense smoldered, then caught, releasing a thick cloud of white smoke that smelled of sandalwood and clove and something else, something sharp and medicinal that made Ren's eyes water and his throat burn. The smoke rose, billowing upward in a column that seemed to glow in the moonlight, and as it spread, the behavior of the Jikininki changed. They lifted their heads from their meals, their noses twitching, their eyes rolling as they sought the source of the scent. One by one, they turned toward the eastern wall, their bodies tensing, their jaws working with a renewed hunger that was almost frantic. They began to move toward the smoke, drawn by an instinct that overrode even their desperate need to feed, and Ren felt a surge of hope that was immediately followed by a surge of terror. The creatures were coming, all of them, abandoning their half-eaten meals and their twitching victims to converge on the beacon of incense. They moved fast, faster than Ren had expected, their elongated limbs carrying them across the courtyard in bounds that covered meters at a stride. "The lintel!" Ren shouted to Hana. "You have to dislodge the lintel stone." They looked around desperately for something to use as a lever, and Hana spotted a fallen roof timber, a thick beam of oak that had broken off during the chaos. Together they dragged it to the wall, positioning one end beneath the cracked lintel and the other extending outward into the courtyard. Ren climbed onto the beam, using his weight as a counterbalance, while Hana pushed from below, her face contorted with effort, her muscles straining against the weight of the stone. The Jikininki were almost upon them, the closest ones reaching out with clawed hands, their jaws unhinging to reveal the rows of needle teeth, their eyes fixed upon the two humans with a hunger that was beyond reason, beyond mercy. "Push!" Ren screamed, throwing all his weight onto the beam, feeling it bend and creak beneath him. "Push harder!" Hana screamed back, a wordless cry of effort, and she threw her entire body against the timber, her feet slipping in the blood-slick stones, her hands blistering against the rough wood. The lintel stone groaned, a sound like the voice of the mountain itself, and then, with a crack that was deafening, it shifted. A shower of dust and mortar rained down, stinging Ren's eyes and filling his lungs, and he felt the beam drop beneath him as the stone gave way. He tumbled to the ground, rolling clear just as the lintel crashed down, striking the courtyard with a force that shook the earth. The eastern wall, deprived of its support, began to crumble, stones falling like rain, the overhanging roof collapsing in a cascade of timber and tile that buried the nearest Jikininki beneath tons of debris. Ren scrambled to his feet, pulling Hana with him, and they ran as they had never run before, their legs pumping, their lungs burning, their ears filled with the roar of the collapsing temple and the screams of the creatures trapped beneath the rubble. The courtyard was a chaos of falling stone and rising dust, the air thick with particles that made breathing impossible, the ground shaking with the force of the destruction. They ran toward the main gate, which had reappeared now that the invisible wing was collapsing, its wooden frame splintering as the walls around it gave way. They reached it just as the final section of the tower fell, a massive block of granite that struck the ground where they had been standing moments before, pulverizing the stones and sending a shockwave through the earth that knocked them both off their feet. Ren landed hard, his shoulder striking the ground with a force that made him cry out in pain, and he rolled, protecting his head with his arms, as debris rained down around him. When the dust began to settle, he looked back and saw that the entire eastern wing of the temple had collapsed, the ruins buried beneath a mountain of rock and timber that rose 20 feet above the original ground level. The Jikininki were gone, trapped beneath the rubble, their screams muffled and then silenced as the weight of the stone crushed them into the earth. But not all of them. Ren saw movement in the dust, figures struggling to free themselves from the edges of the collapse, and he knew that some of the creatures had survived, that they would eventually dig themselves out, that the hunger that drove them would not be stopped by mere stone. "Run!" he croaked, grabbing Hana's hand and pulling her toward the path that led down to the village. "Run and don't look back." They ran, stumbling down the mountain path in the pale light of dawn, their bodies aching, their minds numb, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed and what they had done. Behind them, the temple of Kurohatadera burned, the pyre that had been lit for the ceremony having spread to the surrounding timber, the flames consuming the ruins with a hunger that was almost reminiscent of the creatures they had buried. They did not stop running until they reached the village, which was deserted, its inhabitants having either fled or been consumed in the massacre. They collapsed in the central square, gasping for breath, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and shock, and they watched as the sun rose over the mountain, its light touching the smoke that rose from the burning temple and turning it gold. The survivors straggled in over the next few hours, a handful of villagers who had managed to escape the courtyard in the chaos of the collapse, their faces gray with trauma, their eyes hollow with the things they had seen. There were fewer than 20 of them, out of a village of 200, and they huddled together in the square, too shocked to speak, too frightened to weep. Shimada the elder was among them, his arm broken, his face covered in blood and dust, but alive. He looked at Ren and Hana with eyes that held no accusation, only a deep, abiding weariness, and he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that was also a farewell. "We must leave," he said, his voice cracked and barely audible. "We must go to the next town, to the world beyond this mountain. There is nothing left for us here, only death and ghosts." And so they left, the survivors of Kurohata, walking down the mountain road that led to the valley below, leaving behind the smoking ruins of their temple and the unmarked graves of their dead. They walked for hours, then days, sleeping in ditches and eating berries and roots, their bodies weakened by hunger and grief, their minds haunted by memories that would never fade. Ren and Hana walked together, supporting each other, their hands often clasped for comfort, their silence speaking volumes that words could not express. They reached the neighboring town on the third day, collapsing at the gates, and were taken in by the townspeople, who fed them and clothed them and listened to their stories with expressions of horror and disbelief. The authorities were notified, and a contingent of police and officials set out for Kurohata to investigate, but they returned with shaken faces and vague reports, speaking of landslides and structural collapses, of mass casualties due to a fire that had swept through the temple. The truth was buried with the dead, sealed beneath the stones of Kurohata-dera, and the survivors were encouraged to remain silent, to rebuild their lives in new places, to forget the horrors of the mountain. But they could not forget. Ren became a wandering monk, traveling from temple to temple, never staying in one place for more than a few months, his sleep haunted by the sound of weeping and the sight of peeled flesh. Hana found work as a seamstress in a coastal town, her hands busy with needle and thread, her mind far away in the ruins of her home. They wrote to each other occasionally, short letters that said little but meant much, and they met once a year, on the anniversary of the massacre, to pray for the souls of the dead and the release of the Jikininki. The years passed. The mountain village of Kurohata was abandoned, its fields overgrown, its houses collapsing, its name becoming a whispered legend, a ghost story told to frighten children. The temple ruins were never excavated, the stones left where they had fallen, and travelers who passed by reported strange sounds coming from the rubble, the sound of weeping, they said, and the faint smell of copper and wet earth that lingered even in the heat of summer. And Hana, in her small room above the tailor's shop, grew older, her hair turning fully gray, her face developing lines that spoke of a life lived in the shadow of tragedy. She rarely spoke of that night, and when she did, it was in vague terms, alluding to a fire and a collapse, to a tragedy that had taken her family and her home. But she never forgot. And then, one morning, as she was brushing her hair before the small mirror that hung above her wash basin, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her teeth, which had always been slightly crooked, seemed to have shifted, to have grown, the canines lengthening and sharpening to subtle points that caught the morning light. She stared at her reflection, her hand frozen in mid-stroke, and she remembered the one time she had been forced to eat a piece of raw, tainted meat to survive while hiding in the ruins, the flesh of a rabbit that had died near the temple grounds, its body contaminated by the chalky residue that covered everything. She remembered the taste of it, metallic and wrong, and the way her stomach had churned for days afterward. She remembered Father Kaido's words, spoken in a voice that was already fading into madness. The corruption isn't just a curse of the dead. It's a hunger that can be passed to the living. Hana looked at her teeth, at the sharp points that had not been there yesterday, and she felt the first stirrings of a hunger that was not her own, a craving that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere that was not quite human anymore. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she saw, for just a moment, a reflection in the mirror that was not her own. It was a figure in black robes standing behind her, its jaw hanging loose, its eyes filled with an infinite sorrow, its mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. And then the figure was gone, and Hannah was alone in her room, the morning sun streaming through the window, the sounds of the town beginning to rise from the street below. She ran her tongue over her sharp teeth, tasting copper, tasting hunger, and she knew, with a certainty that was beyond despair, that the Jikininki were not gone. They were merely waiting. And she was one of them now, or would be soon, a vessel for the same curse that had consumed the priests of Kurohatadera centuries ago. She looked out the window at the bright, indifferent world, and she wept, her tears falling onto her hands, her shoulders shaking with a grief that had no end. For she knew that one day, perhaps soon, perhaps years from now, the hunger would become too great to resist, and she would walk into the twilight, following the scent of death, and she would feed, weeping as she fed, her soul screaming with an agony that would never be silenced, not until the mountains themselves crumbled to dust and the last light faded from the world. And in the ruins of Kurohatadera, beneath the tons of stone that sealed them in eternal darkness, the Jikininki stirred in their sleep, their claws twitching, their jaws working, their dreams filled with the taste of flesh and the sound of weeping. They were patient. They had learned patience over centuries of hunger, and they knew, with the deep wisdom of the damned, that the hunger always found a way. Always. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.